right, looks like we're connecting, and I think we're live. Great. So I'm joined here by Lord Quantum Foam of the Teach Up server and others to discuss
Hello.
a very important topic of causality versus temporality.
Looks
So
like we're
we've sort of been
connecting,
over this in
and
chat many times, and I don't
I
feel
think
that
we're
there's
live.
been much
Great.
resolution between our
So
positions,
I'm
which I
joined
think is
here
strange
by
because
Lord
at some level I think we
Quantum
should
Foam
agree
of the
because you are
Teach
some
Up
type of a
server and
substance
others
monist, if I'm recalling
to
that correctly. Why don't you
discuss
tell us
a
a little
very
bit
important
about your
topic
position
of causality
philosophically about the
versus temporality. Looks
so
like
I don't
we're
want to say
connecting,
substance of the universe, but you know
and
in what I'm chat many
asking here.
times, and I don't
I
feel
think
that
we're
Yeah, I
there's
mean,
live.
been much
so yeah, I mean, I
resolution
consider
between our
myself a
positions, which I
modalist
Joined
think is
here
when it
strange
comes to
by
because
substance and
Lord
like
at some level I think we
possibly
should
existence
agree
as
of
well.
the
because you are
Teach
some
Up
type of a
server and
And
substance
others
I mean, I
monist,
do
if I'm recalling that correctly. Why don't you
favor
tell us a
ideas
little bit
like
very
about
emergent
important
your
topic
space-time,
position
of causality
philosophically about the
which
temporality.
is
so
gonna
I don't
mean
want to say
something like
substance of
time
the
is
universe,
not
but you know
And
in
what I'm
chat many
um,
times, and I don't feel
completely
that
yeah, I
there's
mean,
been
fundamental.
much
I mean, I
resolution between
consider
our
that there's
positions,
going
which
to
I
be
think is
a
strange
very
because
fundamental
at
description
some
of the
level I think
world
we
of
should
existence
agree
as well, or something like
because you
that. Um, I don't know if anybody who actually has worked that out yet. Um, and when it comes to causation, I actually don't think causation is fundamental either. Um, I think that our ideas about change, or when I say state change and time, are related to each other, or you could say state evolution, that those are related to time. Um, describe everything going on in the world without ever mentioning space, something like that, or time. Now, like I said, these are just sort of like my preliminary, like,
stop you there for a quick second because you're saying on the one hand sounds like you're saying space and time is are emergent maybe, and that we can describe them and we can describe the world without using them. Are those two statements equivalent?
yeah, roughly speaking, that's how I'm using the ideas. So it's like, so say you want to talk about something like a wave. Let's give an analogy, like a wave in the ocean. Um, you can talk about everything. You can define, like you can specify all the information, all of the physical parameters of that wave by talking about the microstates of all of the molecules in the water, and never mention the wave, right? Um, or you can talk
Well,
about it
no,
from
that's an assertion that has no evidence to back it up. You can say that you want to invoke that as a model, but that's not something
well,
that's self-evident.
let's just yeah, no. I mean, I'm not saying any of this is self-evident. I'm just saying like this is how I'm using the ideas. Like, so just to give like an illustration, like just like if you want to go with me. I mean, we could talk about something different from that. I mean, something that's a little maybe a little bit more simple.
No, I'm just trying to get an idea of where you're coming from. Like, I would have stopped you a while ago if you didn't kind of have a flow going, but I would want to ask if that you see any difference between a non-dualism and a monism, just definitionally, because I've read some people go forward with the position that they're not the same. And I'm just wondering if you think that's like a pedantic thing or
Well, I mean, I
what.
guess you could be like a non both of them, right? So you could say like I don't accept the
Oh, that's fine.
um
I'm not contesting that. The question is there any difference between a non-dualist and a monist? And
yeah, well, I
to state that there is a difference, is that being overly pedantic? I'm genuinely curious what you and anybody else thinks on that one.
I mean, yeah, I think you could say that there is a difference there because like somebody could be a non-dualist and a non-monist, right? And so in that sense, like a monist is making a claim about something that that a non-dualist is sort of just rejecting another claim, right? If you think that it's some kind of true dichotomy, right, then a non-dualist would be a
Well, of
monist,
course
but I
not.
don't.
That doesn't
Somebody
make
could
any
reject
sense.
that.
There's more than
Yeah,
two positions that you can take, so
right.
right.
Like somebody
There
could just reject that it's coherent to even talk about either of them and say I'm not either of those things because I don't think either one of them make any sense like that. Be fine.
sure.
So I think like a non-dualist is sort of just rejecting dualism. They're not necessarily embracing monism, but
So you would say there's a difference then.
yeah, probably. I mean, it's semantic, like but
Well, I mean, if we're referring to things by different words, is certainly we can argue there's a semantic difference. In philosophy, I would say we're sort of asking, are there any other differences than purely semantic ones? And for that one, I'm just not sure. Would you say that
I don't.
entanglement and non-locality are the same thing?
No, I don't think so. I think that in a lot of stuff that Sean Carroll works on, he wants to use entanglement as this more fundamental feature to sort of get the locality in the classical limit, right? Um, so it could be the case that entanglement like just is non-local, which is probably that's probably true. Um, like entanglement itself doesn't require locality to be coherent or to happen. Let's say you don't need to talk about space to talk about entanglement necessarily.
Well,
And so
entanglement
that
is almost pre-spatial is kind of the point that I'm making.
yeah, I would agree with you.
So if entanglement is true, then how can uh doesn't that sort of establish that space as a localization phenomenon must be emergent from that entanglement?
Yeah. I mean, if you want to go there, yeah, I would say probably that's the case. I think that there are probably people out there who still want to maintain that space is not emergent somehow.
Well, of
But I
course,
think,
everybody does. I mean, that's the whole idea.
yeah,
If the Schrodinger equation is a function of space and time, that means that it's emergent from space and time, which makes space and time more fundamental than it. It's the whole
well,
thing with
there
like
are some,
x is the independent variable, and y is the dependent one. So y is like emergent from x.
there are some versions of the Schrodinger equation that don't use like space. Um, they're a little bit more simplified. Um, I mean, there's going to be Hilbert space, right? But that's not the same as like space, like physical space or whatever. Um,
No, a
Hilbert
Hilbert
space
space
is
is
like a
different
vector.
from a physical space. But why don't you tell us how it's different? Because it's not
Well,
self-evident, I don't think.
yeah, I mean, Hilbert space. I'm not really like I'd want to get like Euler or somebody to talk about that a little bit in more like exact detail because I'll probably say something that's wrong. But it's a bit more mathematical. It's a mathematical structure. It's not really like talking about a physical space. It's sort of like saying if we were to talk about the space of all shapes or something like that, like we could talk about an abstract space of things like sets, sort of like we could talk about them that way. Um, And that's like my understanding of Hilbert space, is that it's an abstract sort of like conceptual device, not meant to be taken as like. I mean, it's more like I said, like it's like a conceptual device. Like you could say it's primitive. You could try to say like, well, the reasons we're using it are X, Y, and Z or something like that. But yeah, it's sort of like saying
know that
if we were to
Sean
talk
Carroll
about the
uses it as a
space of
primitive.
all. Yeah. I mean, I was talking like that. You know, like we could talk about an abstract, like he was talking about points in this way of saying like you know, if we're talking about a field, like we could talk about them that way. And we want to say that the field exists, right? And then when we talk about defining what a field is, usually they'll want to say something like, you know, it has a value at every point in space. So it's like invoking a point, right? But the idea is it's using the concept of a point to give like conceptual information about this thing, right? So you don't necessarily need to think that points exist to use them in a conceptual description of another thing. Does that make sense?
No, not to
Well,
me.
I mean, you
sure
could talk about it in a different way, right? Like,
I'm sure it seems like it makes sense to you too, but in terms of what I'll accept for evidence of something being known is much higher.
Oh no, yeah. I'm not trying to be forceful with any of this, really. But what I'm saying is like, so we might define like, let's just say like, for the purposes of what I'm trying to explain, that like there are these things called fields, and there is something called space, and fields really do have like some value at every point in space, right?
Maybe we should come back to the actual point of this topic.
Well, I just wanted to say, like, you could capture what I just said in some other way without using points, right? Like you could come up with a different sort of.
You can say that, quantum, but you can't establish it at all. I don't know why you would say something without asserting any evidence to support it.
Well, I mean, say like instead of talking about points, I use a different like mathematical structure like lines or planes or something like that.
Right,
now, maybe
but a line is derived of a point, so it doesn't have independent arising. So if you want to say, well, I could actually do it differently, you'd have to say, well, I've got this independently arising system, which you can't establish as existing. And that's not your problem. That's an us problem. That's an everyone problem. So I'm not trying to single you out here.
All I'm trying to say is that like you don't need to think that there really are points in the world to use the concept of a point to describe something, right? Like that's I don't know what it would mean for there to be a quote unquote point that exists. I don't think that makes much sense to really consider or take seriously. But I do think it's a useful like concept that we use to build other concepts. Like what you're saying is like, you know, lines are sort of defined in terms of points. You know, points might be primitive, or we might say that they like have relative, you know, distances from each other, or whatever, however we want to talk about it, right? But the thing is it's a concept that we're applying to something, right?
No one's disputing any of that. We want to actually get to something substantial here. So atemporal causality, we already have examples of it. Gravity, there's no T in the formula for gravity. It's just GMM over R squared, right?
Well, that's Newtonian gravity, right?
Do other formulations of gravity have time as one of the variables that determines?
No, I don't know the equations off the top of my head, but you know, gravitational waves and things like this in Einstein's, you know, in relativity, in that way of talking about gravity, like gravitational signals travel at the speed of light. They're not like instantaneous. In Newtonian physics, the gravity is just taken to be sort of this instantaneous thing, which is what leads to a lot of the issues with it. Why it can't accurately capture the orbits of the planets and things like that.
Well, I'm not aware of any of your systems that are capable of solving even a three-body problem, so that's not just Newtonian.
Well, the thing with the three-body problem, like gravitational signals, the thing with light, they're not like the three-body problem is that there isn't like an exact analytic solution to it, meaning that, you know, you could have differential equations that describe it, but you're not going to be able to. Basically, it's to do with chaos theory, right? It's like you're not going to be able to actually calculate it because you don't have precision in the initial conditions. There's huge sensitivity to that. So
and we would like to account for it.
yeah, I mean, and that comes to like making predictions accurately and things like that.
Do
But I mean,
you
like, I would,
concede
yeah.
that there is such a thing as atemporal causality, and all you need is mass to cause gravity, and you're golden. You don't need time for that. That doesn't mean time isn't passing. Time is passing in many frames, many different ways. But can you agree that we don't need time to cause changes?
I mean, so I think that if you have a state, if you have one state and then it changes into another state, that there's sort of a directionality to what you're talking about there. I mean, I do think that change and time are pretty, they're fairly linked in that sense. That if something changes, that it was one way prior and one way afterward, right? So you're already getting into sort of like temporal language when you talk about that.
You don't need to use temporal language. You go with cause, mediator, effect. You don't need to
Yeah,
invoke
but
temporality.
I mean, when you talk
Temporality is
about,
a useful construct, but what would you say if I told you time never caused a single change ever? Time's always the result of change.
well, look, I mean, I would say in like the abstracted picture that I was talking about before, where you're taking an atemporal perspective on things, like you put like the block universe or 4D, that sort of perspective, nothing's going to change.
That's not an atemporal perspective. A 4D perspective is not atemporal because T is one of those 4D, is it not?
Well, what I'm saying is that you're looking at all times at once, right? That's the sort of perspective that I'm talking
Well, you
about. Is
mean
that
all states of the system simultaneously, not all
yeah?
time at once. We don't know if that actually makes sense.
Well,
Like,
I
not
mean,
everything that we think makes sense when you actually go to plug it out, right? Or like calculate it all out and check.
yeah, and I'm not trying to sit here and say like this is like the ultimate or correct answer or anything like that. I'm speaking in terms of like the way we might think about these things, right? So if you're talking about time being emergent or something like that, and you're looking at the block universe like as a whole, if you're considering it as a whole, um, including every uh, you know temporal index like alongside each other. Um, what we call change or state change are just things that happen between different locations in time. Um,
That's something you're saying that you cannot substantiate with any evidence.
no, but it's following from like the
That's what
concept
your
that I'm talking.
mind is telling you. Your mind is saying things are separated in time and space because that's what our brains do. They
Well,
flatten
no,
our
no, no. But
perception.
I'm not trying to say that this is correct. I'm just saying that if you take this sort of, um, if you're looking at it from this view of this idea, right? Like then the whole, right? The whole that you're looking at, it's not changing, right? That's the point I'm making.
If you're looking at it from the perspective of an absolute time, the whole is not changing. I don't think I actually understood what you just said. It was very confusing.
If you were to, well, this isn't talking about like absolute time, like in that sense either. But what I'm saying is, if you had every um, moment in time, right, um, all existing, and you were able to quote unquote look at them all, right? I'm not saying that this is abstract, right? This is not
Yeah,
literal.
looking at them changes them. That's the whole idea with the observer effect and why we keep not being able to converge on our interpretations. You
I
can't
think
look at
like we're
everything
getting.
simultaneously. Looking at something implies that there's a narrowing going on.
I think we're getting too like nitpicky about it because I'm not saying that there aren't like details to this. What I'm trying to say is like, in a simplified picture, if you were to step quote unquote, like if you took a God's eye perspective and you stepped outside of time, right? Um, if you were considering time to be this emergent thing from like a fundamentally like atemporal object or something like that, then the thing you would be looking at that point would not change. It would be static.
I have no clue what you're trying to say here. So I won't agree or disagree because I don't actually understand what you said. I'll think about it.
I'll take a simplified like perspective. Say like that, you know, the universe like has existed for 10 years or something like that, right? And
yes, let's talk about that. What does it mean for a universe to start existing? We have no evidence of that. Let's back it up to something we actually have evidence for, which is a solar system starting to exist, which is an actual example of atemporal causality. High-tech para, nice to see you in the chat. Let's talk about what it means for something to be temporal.
You know? Sure, yeah. I mean, this was what I really wanted to ask you about anyway, because like I feel like the stuff I'm talking about, like again, is like it's speculative physics, but it's like at the same time, it's like I was just trying to elaborate on some of the notions. I'm not trying to say like, oh, I can prove this the way
no,
things
it's
are.
fine. Right? I think the thing is, I think you should try to do that because that would be more, if not more compelling to people, because maybe people aren't convinced by arguments, more satisfying to yourself. Right now, you're just like, oh, I feel like this is happening. It's like, who gives a shit about your feelings? Like, your mom probably borderline doesn't give a fuck about your feelings, like, let alone anyone else, right? People want to see the beatdowns.
Like something like, imagine like taking 5 minutes like of worth of time, like, and in some, you know, you draw a box somewhere in the universe, and you have every like, and say time is continuous too. It doesn't even have to be discrete, right? I mean, it could be discrete, it could be continuous, blah blah blah. But what I'm saying is, you have all the information, and you're looking at all of it at once, right? I don't want to say at the same time, but like at once is like a clear way of like just this notion, right? You're looking at every single instant of what happened in that box over the course of 5 minutes, right? At each instant, whatever happened or whatever the state was at that instant, that's fixed, right? And so the whole thing that you're looking at, like if you were actually in the box, like in time, let's say, you would see things changing and moving around, right? But when you can see all of these moments in time at once, you're seeing like the spline or whatever, the temporal extension of objects, but the whole thing would be static. Like you wouldn't be changing individual events that were occurring in the box. They would all be there like statically, I guess. Anyway,
yeah, you're saying that the observer can be separated from the observation, and I'm saying it can't be. And every time we think that it can be, it causes some type of an artifacting effect somewhere else. So due to conservation law, you know what I mean by artifacting?
Sure, and I guess like
oversampling bias or something like that.
Yeah, like I'm not even considering an observer, I guess, in the way I'm talking about it. I'm just considering.
Well, the thing is, you are thinking about an observer. You're just not seeing how. So when you're talking about interpolating across a 5-minute interval every instance, what's doing that? Excuse me. What is doing that? It's an observer.
Well, I'm not saying anything is doing it. I'm just saying like that there's certain information.
The only way to access that information is with an observer.
Right, but you don't need to actually physically do this, though. That's the thing. Like, I'm not saying that
you do though, because the relief that you're talking about, the map you're describing, doesn't exist without it being observed.
I don't know. Well, okay, I'm going to disagree there, but I wanted to talk about
You're saying only one thing exists, okay? I know the mechanics and the math of one thing only existing. You can't account for stuff unless it's one thing and all of its proper states. So what's your one thing?
Oh, I mean, when I say like only one thing exists, I mean like the whole world is that thing, right? Like what I'm really saying when I say that is that the things that we typically refer to as like, oh, there's a ball over here, that's a thing, right? That is nominal, and that's our attaching a label to like a chunk of the world, and it's arbitrary. For the most part, it's for convenience. I want to say something like a ball or an apple or whatever, like they don't have independent existence, or like in a sense, like they are just connected to everything else in the same way that everything else is, and so when I say like one thing exists, I mean like in a metaphysical sense, like there's really just one thing, and that's the whole of the world.
Okay. And then it's a question of what's the best way to interpret that.
Yeah. I mean, and definitely that's where all the details happen.
And if you're going to insist that causality is temporal, de facto, that makes time a metaphysical primitive, which means everything must be time.
Well,
That
no,
doesn't
because like I
work.
said earlier,
But I can tell
think
you why that doesn't work, because for something to be temporal implies it is at a very high energy state, and our universe does not favor those.
Well, I don't think that causation is fundamental either. But that being said, like I actually don't know. So we were talking about change in time being inextricable from each other, but I mean, I am amenable to saying that you could have like simultaneous causes or something like that, like in the way we talk about causation generally speaking. Like I'm fine with saying that there could be simultaneous causation. You know what I mean?
Well, no. I'm not sure what you mean by that, simultaneous causation. Are you saying that a cause can be equal to its effect?
No. I mean, I'm saying like a cause and its effect can be simultaneous with each other, so that they don't.
Oh, you're saying that a cause and an effect can be co-arising. Doesn't that imply? Okay, well, what does that imply then?
I mean, I'm not really sure, and I don't know that many good examples of this sort of thing. And because again, like I don't take causation to be like fundamental, right? So when I talk about cause, it's going to be descriptive of like relations between events or something like that. And you might say that two events have some causal relation, but that they happen at the same time, right?
But you're still using
I
causality
mean,
there.
yeah.
So it's not clear to me how you can get rid of causality, but we didn't say we're going to talk about getting rid of causality. We said we're going to talk about what it means for something to be caused atemporally and whether it's possible for there to be temporal causality. So let's try to find the best evidence to substantiate temporal causality, i.e. that time causes change.
Oh, you want to say time is a cause?
Well, that's literally what the but that's what the convo with Zyga and you was about before we did the stage, was that exact question.
Well,
Whether
would you say that
temporality
space
and
is a
causality
cause?
were the same thing, right? And
I
I
mean, you
was
might say
saying no,
time.
and you guys were saying yes.
Well, I mean, I think he was saying change and time are the same, or related, or that
Yeah.
you need to have. Well, you need to have time if you're going to have changes or something like that. That I would agree with. I don't know that causation requires anything to change.
Causation is the force of change. That's the whole idea. Causes mutate or whatever into effects. Causes going to effects. That's what change is. This is another definition.
Well, I mean, I feel like I could come up with sort of like abstract examples of like, I don't
Right.
know.
You're
It would
still
be.
trying to have a semantic. You should not be trying to have a semantic argument with me. You should be trying to understand what I am saying so that you can see whether you agree with me. You don't even understand what I'm saying at this point.
Well, I think so. I think you want to put causation and change together, and I want to put time and change together, right?
I don't know that I would go that far. I'm still using these concepts provisionally. I'm saying causality is a good fundamental model for physics, material physics.
I mean, causality is definitely a very useful idea in physics. I think that in a lot of cases, like when you talk about these sort of like really fundamental, like stripped down theories, especially with like emergent space-time and stuff like that, that it gets a little blurrier at that level when you're talking about causes. So I want to say something like this: like in order for us to have a state transitioning to another state, in a sort of nth way, where you could say that
Slow down. Did you say an nth way? Because I don't understand what that means.
Tense, like past tense, future tense. It's tense.
Yeah, okay, so you said there's a state transition, then you talked about time and you lost me. Why'd you bring up state transition?
Well, because I think that if state transition is a way of talking about things changing, right? Like from one state to another
It's a
state, right?
very good way to talk about it. That's still a causality mechanism.
I mean, it could be, right? I don't want to say like definitely
The
no or anything.
state,
I want to
okay,
say that
just
that's
listen, it's like with the logical laws. You can always restate it so that they're unfalsifiably true. It's like the state transition. Why is there a state transition? Oh, well, a cause. And what is the result of that state transition? Well, it's another state. We're going from one state to another, and it's just a bunch of state transition.
Yeah, and you might want to say, I mean, so like there's debates in like metaphysics to be had about whether or not things happen that are uncaused, right? That have no
That's not what
causes.
this is about. This is about a physical model and your failure to account for anything in physics and failure to acknowledge that.
Well, no. I mean, I'm just trying to go through like a couple of concepts really with you, but like, I mean, the what I'm trying to say is like if you have a state that changes, that is going to sort of imply time.
Says you.
Yeah, I know, but that's
You've
the
said
way I
this
think.
3 times now, and you've said that a state change implies time, and I'm saying I agree. It feels like time causes change. But do you have any evidence that isn't a personal feeling?
Well, I don't think that that's not really what I'm saying. 'Cause I'm not saying that time causes it to change. I'm saying that like when you talk about it changing, you are talking about time.
But I don't have to talk about time. I can talk about state transitions. I can talk about causality. I can invoke any
Right.
number of things. I don't have to reference time. You can't point to a single reason why I should care about time. But you're
Well,
always coming back and saying, well, we have to conceive of this as a moment in time. It's like, and I'm saying your very conception of it as such is preventing you from seeing it as it is.
well, maybe it is. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. I'm not saying that, right? I'm not.
Time co-arises. I can deduce it with you using logic, but you got to put your emotions to the side. Okay, you can't just be like, well, it feels like, yeah, I get it. I know what it feels like, but this isn't what it
Well,
feels like. It's about what you can
I,
establish using a process of inference that is guaranteed to work because
right.
you're
And
using a meta-analytical approach. And that's why I'm saying the
yeah,
beginning of our solar system is very important because
yeah.
it proves that time is not permanent.
Yeah, so this was the thing I was confused about that I wanted to ask you. I can only talk for probably another like 10 minutes or so, something like that. But so the thing is that yeah, I wanted to ask you why you thought that in some sense time started when planets formed or something.
Because that's definitionally coming out of our scientific experiments.
Well, I mean, just to say, like, I mean, if something forms, right? Like,
Look,
if a rock,
time passes and nuclear decay happens. If you're going to deny that, we're not talking about physics anymore.
no,
All right?
I don't deny it. I don't
Now
deny
you
it.
want to say that all causality is temporal, and I'm going to say, all right, time started in our solar system, and every single entity, including the sun, is the same age, measured to be the same age, using
Well,
meta-validated technology across
okay,
multiple entities, validated. That means that time is not something that goes on forever, at least locally. Time started locally. That is what that tells us, is it not?
no, but I don't think so. I don't think so
Then you
because
have no way to establish what you think. So
well,
why should it
no.
matter what you think?
When you talk about when the planets formed, right? Like I would agree that happened like a finite time ago, right?
It
Um,
happened a finite and measurable to within a fairly high degree of
sure,
accuracy time ago.
Sure, I agree. I agree with it, right? But what I'm saying is that when it comes to that specific thing that we're talking about, like the formation of the solar system or whatever, I I don't conceive of it as just like it appeared and that's how time started or something like that. Obviously, there were
That's what,
processes.
but don't you think that's what the matter is telling us? That
No,
it
I
wasn't
don't.
there and then it was.
No, I don't think that's telling us that at all. Like the thing is like when you look at the decay rates of like uranium and various like isotopes that
So do
um,
you favor the
have mass,
accretion
like
model?
yeah.
So how come there was no decay while there was accretion?
Well, I mean there was, but
How come time wasn't passing, but we can't measure any of that time? We can only measure 4.5 billion years. How come we can't go further back in that matter?
well, we do go
And you want
further
to say,
back than
well,
that.
time went on forever except until the Big Bang, and then before that we don't know, and there was inflation, and that's it.
Well, I like Penrose's version, but I mean that's neither here nor there. The point though is that like you know I don't even understand how it's coherent to think of the planets as forming. Um, like so like yeah, sure we can sample like radioactive elements and we can use
It's
these
a state
models.
of matter. Think of temporality as a state of matter. Matter that's dark matter, like the blackness in the sky, that's non-temporal. There's no time passing there because the energy is too low. And then when it's luminous, time can pass. That's your way to know.
Um, I don't know if I followed that, but
You
I mean,
cannot disentangle time from light. From all your physics points that light's more fundamental than time. Nothing
um,
suggests that time is anything other than an ephemeral rising with no causal powers.
um, yeah, maybe it doesn't have causal powers. What I want to like what I don't understand though is that like all of the math that they're using to give you that age of the planets, right?
Ah, okay.
All of the assumptions that go into like radiometric dating. Um,
What assumptions go
they're
into radio? There are almost no assumptions that go into radiometric dating.
well,
The
look,
assumptions are reverse engineered based on the tech working on, based upon emission and absorption spectra.
well, no, it's like so say like I mean we have data about the decay rates of certain elements that we have like it's inductive that we're saying like we observe that it happens at this frequency now and
Don't
then
stop. Wait,
we're
hang on a
assuming
minute. You were asking a quasi good question. You were saying, how come the answer is right even though we're wrong about the assumption? I'm saying, are you sure the assumptions are actually there?
well yeah I think that there's going to be I mean look you could just say oh the whole solar system as it exists now like came into existence with all of that appearance of it having decayed for however long um, in some shorter length of time. Like it could have come, maybe it came all into existence 2 billion years ago, and it already had the signature of the decay having occurred for 2 billion years prior. But that's just how it came into being. It was like you see what I'm saying? Like you could just say that. We're assuming that we can keep going further back. Um, Now, if you looked at like if you look at like when they talk about the formation of like the uranium that's in the earth, um, you can look this up. They say that that is forming like sometime like 6 billion years ago in another supernova, right? Um, so
But we really
like what
want
I'm
the
saying,
simplest model, right? That makes all the predictions. We want something really well substantiated. So Daryl's putting a bunch of stuff in the chat here. And if you push him far enough, he's just like all these other flatheads who love the PLT there. Cannot get away from the PLT. There's a
yeah, I only have
reason
like
we call you head curry. It means flathead. It's this parallel lines theorem. It's a real problem in conceptualizing. But yeah, just to come back to this atemporal causality, did I make any points that may sway you to the idea that time is actually doesn't have causal powers?
Oh, you think it doesn't have causal powers? I agree with that. I don't think it does
Then why
have
would you
like.
spend so much time apparently disagreeing? It's extremely confusing to me. It's like you want to disagree.
I don't think we disagree all that much. I mean, I want to say something like, I mean, do you agree that like heavy elements are produced in stars and things like that, or
It would be
like
nice
through
if
fusion?
you had,
But do you agree
a
that stars
basic
do
idea. See,
like
here's the
stars
thing
are
is,
doing fusion, right?
sell me
Like,
your model, Quantum. Sell me your
right.
model. What's the
I'll
selling
try.
point?
I
Is
only
it going to give me enlightenment by practicing it? Because that's what you're up
no,
against right now. Just saying.
no, not really. I mean, I only have like a minute or so. I gotta hop off in a second. But
Is Moop going to come up? Because I wouldn't mind having a round with Moop. Is he in the...
yeah, feel
Hey,
free to
Moop.
replace me with him in a second. But I just want to say this, like, I mean, yeah, like stellar
Well, if anyone
fusion and
wants to come
stuff like.
up, please come up or raise your hand, and Quantum's going to give us his last words. And what a
Yeah,
great
yeah, yeah.
time.
So I mean, I think we have pretty good evidence for how fusion works. Like we have fusion reactors that we
That has fuck
perform.
all to do with cosmology,
Let
cosmology,
me
bub.
finish my sentence, bro. The idea is, I mean, obviously that in the mainstream line of thinking that stars that fusion happens in the core of stars, and that when you fuse heavier, you can generate heavier elements through fusion, through a process of fusion, and that's where heavy elements come from. Is from stars for the most part. So that's where like all of the radioactive elements that you're going to use for radiometric dating are being produced through fusion in stars. And so like the processes that are being assumed in just they're not being assumed 100% because we have other lines of reasoning, like I just was going through about fusion. We have a lot of lines of reasoning for thinking that this is what happens, but when you take that and apply it to trying to date the planets, they're going to be using those ideas of how stars form, how planets form, etc. And if you throw that away, I don't know that your inference to the age of a planet is even valid anymore. If you're just going to say like, well, we want to keep all the stuff that we're using. We want to keep
Good
all the
one.
stuff that we're
Good
using.
one.
Yeah, it's
That
because if
is
you say
a fucking great amount of straw manning. You got me to take credit for your fucking calculational error. You voiced that was an amazing amount of that was like a straw man plus a goalpost shift entangled power of 8. Can't wait to talk to you, the boobinator. It's gonna be a good one. I might need a little drinky. Throat's a little scratchy. Go ahead, Quantum. You were telling us about how some stuff means that I'm wrong.
no, I gotta hop off now anyway. Yeah, no, I mean, I just if you're taking seriously the reasoning behind why we think that the planets are 4.5 billion years old, based on radiometric dating, etc. I'm just saying that like that's all part of the other ideas that we have as well. I don't know that you can just
I'm afraid that is a
keep
you
that.
problem. That is a
That
you problem, my friend. Enjoy your day.
it might be.
Thank you very
All
much
right,
and come again. Looking forward to next time. Thank you. Oh,
thank
yes,
you
sir.
very much.
It's been very wonderful. Ooh. Please proceed. You're muted.
How's it going? Can you hear me?
Just looking up at my degree that's framed in the most expensive frame from my university because my grandma wanted to spoil me.
Yeah,
I
okay.
graduated cum laude from physics. How's it going, Ass Clown?
Yeah, it's not bad. How are you?
You know, win some, you lose some. So, atemporal causality, your thoughts? Or did you want to take it in a different direction? It's all good.
I think it just comes down. I mean, it sounds to me like it comes down to what you think causality is.
I think it's the observer effect. I mean, it's so poorly understood.
Why do you think the causality is the observer effect? What do you mean by it?
You just said, I think it comes down to causality. And I said, I think it kind of comes down to the observer effect. I mean, causality is almost too abstract because causality is not really a model. It's like a framing.
What observer
Like
effect are you
imagine a
talking about?
model
Are
of
we talking
causality,
about
like C equals 4 plus, 2. It just sounds crazy, right?
what observer effect are you talking about, and how does it relate to what causality is?
Well, you're saying I think it's going to come down to causality. I'm saying I agree, but that's too vague. And that
No,
specific
no.
form of causality it's going to take is the observer effect.
Yeah,
And
what I
how
what I meant,
we,
I think it's gonna come down to what your analysis of causality is, like what you think, what the conditions are, like what causality actually means.
eh, I don't know. To me, it's just a framework. It's a Trinitarian framework. You have a cause, you have an effect, and you have a mediator that goes between them. And those three things can be
Yeah.
different. I don't think they can be the same.
What
It's sort of a
different
necessary.
what
I would define
differentiates
it.
cause
I
and
would
effect?
I would define it as a minimum necessary separation to resolve concepts.
What defines what's like the conceptual difference between an effect and a cause to you?
Well, that's the whole thing. Is it's like it is itself the conceptual guideline. So you're sort of presupposing that when you come into something, it's going to be broken down into it's going to be best understood as either a cause, an effect, or a mediator.
Okay.
And that's
It,
a sort of a pre-conceptual, I guess you could call it a belief.
so do you think it's like a fully? Are you saying you think it's like fully primitive? You just can't explain what it means except for comprehending what it is.
You can explain what it means, but you cannot give it an independent arising because that is not a thing.
Okay.
Because it's sub observational or like sub whatever you want to call it. It's pre, I don't want to say metaphysical, but that's really the best word for
Right.
it.
I'm not. I guess I don't. I just don't really know what you're saying. I don't know what you mean. But I mean, what makes you think that were you saying that you think that causality is atemporal?
We were discussing what it meant for there to be atemporal causality. And
Right. Yeah.
I was trying to forward the argument basically that it appears that time is the cause of change based on our impressions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my interaction with people talking about cause and effect. Usually, it seems like they're defining. They're just literally defining cause and effect on the basis of being before and after. Like if you're
And
not doing that, and I don't
I
know
am
what
not doing that at all. I'm saying that that is actually a huge mistake to do. Okay, you just went silent. I thought maybe you had some like a follow up. I was just trying to grab a
apologies. No, no,
diagram.
sorry. My mic wasn't working.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
I mean, I guess I want to distinguish, yeah, as it's a framing. Causality is a framing
Okay.
that is
So can you?
extremely useful in physics because
Okay.
physics is all about mechanics, generally understood to be mechanics. So causality as a rigid framing works to break everything down like a machine.
Yeah, I don't
Uh,
necessarily disagree with that. That
are
sounds
there other situations where causality may not be the most apt primitive framing? Sure. Right. There's kind of two lessons to be had here. There's the lack of independent arising lesson, which is that you can't make certain like, there's like a trade-off between generality and precision on the level of what lends itself to certain types of syntactical decompositions, I believe you call them. I have shared in the chat here the two options for modeling a quantum system. So basically what I'm saying is that the top one is what it appears to be, but the bottom one is the reality.
okay. So right. So do you think that it seems here like you're trying to say at times like might be overinterpreting this image you put in the chat 'cause I'm not actually sure it says a lot, but it seems like what you're trying to say is that like space and time is sort of like inherently like independent of one another, like, but they're not.
I'm not saying that at all.
I don't understand what you're trying to write here then.
I'm saying that in the first case,
All you've written here is y is a function of x and t, and then
I
lower
just
down.
didn't want to I didn't want to inherit all the clunkiness of the Schrodinger equation. But it's the general idea of the Schrodinger equation, but without the algebraic morass of
Well, yeah, you can.
presuppositional
So are
garbage.
you saying like you is what you're trying to say here that you can decompose like a state into a space dependent and a time dependent part?
Okay, I'm not saying that. I'm saying we have two ways we can look at this. We can look at the wave function as being something that space and time determines. Or we can look at space and time as something that the wave function determines.
Okay, I'm not sure what you mean by that. But also the maths is wrong. Like x is a
There's
function.
no math here. There's
Yeah,
no
yeah,
math.
there is.
This is
There is.
pre-mathematical. An equation is
Oh,
not
sorry,
necessarily
right.
mathematical, Mr. Logic.
Right, you're not saying that the second one follows from the first, right? I understand. No,
I'm
my
saying
bad.
there are two options.
They're two different options. Yeah, yeah,
Can you read the title? What does it say?
yeah. You're right. I misread it. It's my
You
bad.
really want to disagree? It's like,
Look.
I know you're young and you really want to disagree with me. It's just like, how about let's actually wait till we can be sure we disagree on something so it makes sense. The audience is just like, what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, all I've been trying to do so far is pin down what the thesis is that you were trying to defend a minute ago, and what you think causality is. But I don't understand how. Like, if what you're saying is that, because you're right, if what you're saying is that in the Schrodinger equation you can decompose a state into a space and time dependent part, and that's the second option, if that's what that's supposed to mean, then I guess it's true. But that's only true in the Schrodinger equation, as far as I'm aware, but it's in the non-relativistic limit.
We don't want to like get bogged down with too much stuff. We want to be rooted in observational certainty to the extent that it can be meta-analytically verified. Something like emission and absorption spectra of stars.
Yeah, I mean, relativity is confirmed by like a emission and absorption spectra. So I don't know what you mean there. Sorry.
Well, the fact that you're saying relativity, not specifying general or special, makes me think you sound like a propagandist yet again, which is fine, but let's try to cover it up just a little bit so that the audience doesn't fall asleep. So somebody in the chat says, give me a clue about the boundary conditions of this universe. There is no boundary, and I'll be temporarily grateful for the future that I can't even prove exists, although I have no reason to think there isn't one. I'm not sure what that means, but
Yeah, nor am I. He seems to hate philosophy for some reason. He DM'd me earlier about it. I don't really understand what his hatred
I also
is for.
said I rage quit when someone said that QE could exist without locality. Locality is a concept, and if it feels really real to us, that should be a red flag that it's maybe not absolutely real.
What do you mean? But can you still? Because I've been trying to ask what do you mean when you use the word causality and cause and effect, but you haven't really explained it yet in a way that I could, at least the way that I could understand.
Because the way that it gets explained is domain dependent, and we would need to go into a particular domain. But we haven't really gone into a domain because you want to undermine my authority, which is fine.
No, I don't. I really just want to understand what you're saying so I can decide whether I agree with you or not. Because at the moment, I'm not sure. But
at some point, you're going to need to take a blind leap of faith, because to think that you could transcend the totality of the knowledge in advance of embracing a path of learning the knowledge, which can take lifetimes, is completely errant.
What? Okay.
You can get an idea. I can walk you through an example of a result of this process that I would argue is valid and sound.
Yeah. So what I was going to say next was, could you give me like maybe even 2 or 3 examples of what you think like what causation is? Like in physics or something, right? Like not just trivial examples, but
it's a general concept that underlies models. A model is a hypothetical. A model is a hypothetical causal mechanism.
A model is a hypothetical causal mechanism.
Yeah, we use
Uh,
these as provisional until a better theory comes along in theory with science method being testable.
could you give me some examples then, or?
You don't know examples of causality mechanisms? Seriously, like, don't insult my
Well, like,
intelligence here. We
so this
both
is what I mean.
know what causality like could possibly refer to.
Okay, so this is the problem: is that there are examples that you could give that'd be really obvious, like the rain causing my coat to get wet or something like that. But what I asked for
That is
was
not that is not a good example. A good example would be to
causation.
break down special relativity and to say, well, what is caused and what's the cause and what's the
Yeah,
effect in
so
special
so
relativity?
I was
And
asking you for an example.
since you're so smart, why don't you tell us what's the cause and the effect in special relativity?
Well, I'm not sure that there's a cause and effect in special relativity.
Well, if there's equations, I'm afraid that's wow.
If there's equations, then it's causation. Is that what you think?
Do you deny this?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, yeah, maybe,
Maybe,
yeah.
yeah, sure, okay.
Well, I mean, so if causation is like inherently temporal, then
Why does it keep
equation
coming
I
back to
guess
this? Notice how nobody has been able to consider the possibility that causality is non-temporal. No
right. So
one's been
what?
able to
So, all
consider
right.
this
Okay.
because they're stuck in a
All
incorrect
right.
mode
Okay.
of
So
thinking. This is why
instead of
you do
asking
not
me
want to
questions,
embrace incorrect modes of thinking because you get stuck in them.
okay. So instead of just asking you more questions, I'll give you what I think basically is my view about it. Um, I think that there definitely can be and are types of temporally asymmetric dependence relations. So you could have, for example, like, sometimes these get called causation, right? So you could have a kind of causation where you could say, so say, if you model the thermodynamics of a gas, you would assume that it's composed of tiny little like point particles or molecules or whatever that bump into each other and stuff like that, and that reproduces the like macro scale properties of the gas that we see. You could say that the behavior of the molecules causes the behavior of the gas on those macroscopic scales, but that type of causation doesn't necessarily occur over time. So in that sense, there could be
Don't you
atemporal
realize
causation.
that, okay, because time is ongoing here, we can't establish atemporality here? It's not like we can be like, hold on, planet, just pause. Let's do some
Well,
experiments and we'll start the planet back up. We can't do that.
yeah. Well, but so what I mean though is that like, so
The point is
obviously
we're
you would agree.
ensconced in in temporality right now. Like
Say that again.
George
Sorry.
Costanza in Velvet.
What did you say? Sorry.
I said we are currently ensconced in temporality. That's why things called watches work.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, do you understand the point I was trying to make about the gas?
I think
Though.
you're
Right.
still trying to argue against a straw man of my views about causality.
No, no. I was trying to give an example of why you might think that there is such a thing as atemporal causation. Isn't that in agreement with you?
Mm, well, I mean, I wouldn't say I agree with every example of atemporal causality because it would depend on the subject. Like the best way to understand something is topic dependent.
Yeah, that's why I came up. That's why I was doing the example of the gas because that's a specific example.
Okay, and causality may not be the best way to understand a gas, even though it is
Yeah,
subject to
maybe not. Maybe
causality.
not. Maybe not. But on you, yeah, sure, maybe not. But that's why I was asking you for examples because there are these examples in physics where it's not certain that causality is the best way to understand it. That's why I originally asked you for examples from physics.
Well, if you want to cast doubt on causality being the best way to understand something, the burden of proof is on you. It's
Well, you
not a
could say.
discussion about
Do
undermining
you think that
causality
there's a
itself.
distinction?
This
Okay,
is
so
not a discussion of this is about causality, whether it's temporal or atemporal, not
okay, so
whether
do you
it's
think there's a
useful as a
distinction
concept.
between? Would you agree that there's a distinction between causality and laws of nature, or do you think they're sort of the same thing?
That's a semantic digression I don't really want to go down.
Not
I want to keep
really.
it on the topic of
Well, what I'm saying is, do you think that
why do you
those?
seem to be unable to discuss the difference between atemporal and temporal causality? Doesn't that give you perhaps pause that your perceptions and understanding are wrong?
I'm really just trying to pin down what you mean by causality, like what you think is different
You will
about
not be
causality and
able to
laws
do
of
that
nature.
as it represents an understanding that is vastly superior to your own. You can't understand what I understand. I can give you clues, and you can eventually get to a point where it makes more sense, which would be really nice, given that you allegedly have a background in physics and you could
Yeah.
meaningfully discuss these topics about atemporal causality, which I think it's pretty clear gravity establishes you can have causality that has nothing to do with time. Because
Do
gravity
you
is
think? How,
caused
why do
by
you think
mass.
that? Why do you think
Gravity
that?
is caused by mass, period.
Say that again, sorry.
Gravity is caused by mass, period.
Okay.
That's
What
why.
does that mean for atemporal causation then?
Well, if causality is temporal, that means that it change is a function of time.
Sure.
Modifications, arrays, everything that happens was changed to get to where it is. Therefore, time caused everything. That's what temporal causality is. Time is the force of change, basically. You understand it differently?
I'm not sure I do, but there you go. That is
So
often how I
great.
feel. I mean, it seems like you're just waffling a lot. I don't understand. I keep asking you a pretty simple question, but you can't you can't answer it.
You can't answer it, and you have no idea how simple a question is that you can't answer. So now you want to switch it into something else.
No,
Do
it's
you
a
concede that
question.
gravity is atemporal causality because it doesn't invoke the time variable ever?
Um, it does. I don't know what you mean by that. Still,
I
to
don't
be
need to make
honest.
a temporal measurement to measure gravity because it's determined by mass.
Yeah.
So it's atemporal because time didn't cause it, is what I'm saying, unless you understand differently, which you can't establish that you do. So I don't
I
see
don't
why you're
think
so
that.
hell bent on disagreeing with me when I'm going as far as I can to get on the same page here.
I think what you just said, which is that atemporality, because what you just said there is that it's not caused by time, therefore it's atemporal. That was what you said, but that's not what atemporal means.
Well, why don't you tell us how you understand the term atemporal?
So when someone says something's atemporal, they just mean that it's not temporal, and when someone says something's temporal, what they mean is it occurs over time or has a position in time, essentially. Like it occurs at a moment in time.
Do you realize that's self-referential, right?
No, not really.
You
Temporal
just
and
said
time
time is time. Yeah, basically.
no, I didn't. No, I said temporality is the I guess the property of being in like occurring at a moment in time.
Temporality, the property of happening in a moment in time.
Yeah.
Temporality is derived from the word time. So you're not really
Yeah.
adding any new
Yeah.
information here.
Just because there's like a relationship between the words, like linguistically, doesn't mean that they refer to the
There's
same concept.
also nothing other than a semantic distinction here. So unless you'd like to cite an actual distinction, can we move on here? And can you concede that gravity appears to be a temporal causality? Now I'm asking you, can you establish temporal causality, even one example of it?
One example of temporal causality.
I will proffer that you cannot because time is actually emergent.
I can give you a pretty yeah. Well, I that might be true, yeah, but I can give you a pretty easy example of something that's also emergent and occurs over time. Like I kick a
Time
ball.
has no causal powers.
I kick a ball. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I kick a ball and it smashes a window, and
So if
the ball in the
something
window.
has no causal powers, does it exist?
Um, maybe that's the
Well, I
answer.
mean, if something
Maybe.
has no causal powers, on what level could it be said to exist?
Um, I think I'd possibly agree with you.
What would you call it, though? I mean, philosophically, you're the expert here, not me.
What would I call it? I just say it doesn't. I just say it didn't exist.
If something was widely referenced yet had no causal powers, we might call it imaginary or a hallucination or a
Yeah,
mirage or
of
even an
course.
illusion, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, it's still. I just still need to know what you mean by causal power, because I mean, on
What
one
I'm
level, you
saying
might be
is,
right.
you cannot give me a single example where this thing you call time exerts causal powers.
I don't think I can. No, you're right. I'm not sure I can. But it's
And
also because I
therefore, it is a mere um, mental construct.
maybe that's a super controversial thing
Oh
to
my
say.
God, it's not. It is a not it is like I don't want to say a steel man of that position because like like I'm only so powerful, but so it is an accurate representation of the position. It is merely extrapolating what the position itself already intrinsically contains as information.
Okay. Well, I mean, you're saying that you think that if something's not causal, then it doesn't exist. But
I
the thing
didn't
is that
say that, Moop. I didn't say that. I'm repeating
well,
what I
you
heard
did. You
someone
said
else
time.
say on Discord. Someone
You
else
said
said that
you said
if something has no causal powers, it doesn't have existence. It only has a it is a mental construct, essentially, like a
yeah. I never said that though. Why? So I don't. So if you don't think that, I don't understand why you're saying it.
was just testing it out on you.
Okay.
And you buckled. You folded like a chair, mate, but it's all right. I still like you. And I like you too, Lord Quantum. Even though you said I was mean to you, I was extremely respectful towards you, given how dumb your arguments were.
Okay. I mean, fair play. I don't know what else to say. I
Would
just
you like me
it's,
to explain the model of how stars are formed? I could do that. It's from
no.
quantum state exclusion.
I'm happy. I'm happy without that. Thank you.
So you just wanted to come on to argue in a position you don't understand, and you still agree that causality is 100% temporal, and you're good with that.
Well, I wanted to figure out what your position was before making my mind up on it and telling
And
you my
I
opinion.
was just saying I was going to tell you, and you didn't want to hear it, so that's fine.
Well, you're talking about now you're talking about stars. Like I thought we were talking about
Part of my position is how stars are formed. You might be able to understand it if you try really hard.
You what? So
And
what's the
once you
relation?
understand it, you can decide if you agree with it. And if you don't, I'll be like, that's cool. It's you're
Don't
no
stars
obligation to
form
agree.
over time? Don't stars form over time though? I don't understand what.
Well,
What? I don't understand
that's your idea. I don't think that's coherent.
Right. Okay.
Whether it's coherent remains to be seen, and that's
Well,
fine.
don't necessarily because they're like they're from big bits of gas that get really dense over time. Like literally, literally happens over time. Like they take millions of years to form and shit.
Sounds a lot like evolution apologetics.
How is it evolution apologetics? Sorry.
It just sounds like it. It's like, oh, will happen over so many years, time, millions of
Well,
years
yeah,
of
you're
time.
saying. Are you not? So you're not saying that star formation is atemporal. If you're not, I don't understand how it's related. How it's related.
I'm saying
Well,
that stars are formed, and
it's
I can actually establish this with evidence because I have a link for it, which is great.
if this is how the conversation is going to go, I'm going to dip out because I'm finding it to be mostly incoherent. What you're
You're
saying.
at what are you? Okay, are you gonna actually give it? Are you actually gonna give it a chance to understand it, or have you already made up your mind here? Because you keep saying you want me to explain, and then I go to
Yeah, yeah.
explain, and
But
then
the
you
thing is,
say,
you
"Oh, I'm gonna
explanations.
dip out because I don't want to understand it." It's like, well, do you want the evidence or not? Because I can give you evidence that stars are formed instantly.
Go on then.
I'll put it in the chat right now.
Yeah, big time.
Blasts of matter from a black hole, which I predicted based on maximum density of that array. Where would you expect to find quantum state exclusion? Where there's a maximum density. What's going to give you a star? Quantum state exclusion. It's the way to get a cyclic universe with recombinance, and you don't have to worry about energetic debts. Mea culpa asks, this is not supposed to be a debate, right? Every time I've talked to this person, it's turned into a debate.
I
But
can't.
I would
I'm
like
not
to
finding
think here's the thing about me is I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. Yes, it ends me up looking and
I've been
feeling like
read
a
this
fucking
article.
dumbass a
I
lot of the
opened,
time. I'm willing to live with that. That's
I
me.
opened the article you were talking about, and I couldn't find any. I can't find any reference to the instantaneous formation of stars in here.
Okay, look, black hole bursts, okay?
Yeah, that's not.
Very
That doesn't mean.
quickly. Very
That doesn't mean.
quickly.
That's not
Okay.
instantaneous, though.
It's not over millions of years, Moop, is it?
Where does it say
Why
that?
can't
Where does
you
it say
ever? Here's a question. Can you concede that your model is wrong because this evidence right here is in direct contradiction of what you just said, which is that stars form over very long periods of time, and so I have to take your word on it? No, I don't.
Okay,
There,
will you
it
please
is right
find?
now happening.
Will you give me the specific quote in the article that is talking about what you're talking about right
It's
now?
literally the name of the article.
So you
Do you know what
referenced the
witness
headline of
means?
the
You know
article.
what witness
You're
means?
citing the
Okay.
headline of the article.
Do you know what a witness means, buddy? It's
You're
the
talking about
observer
that.
effect.
You're just referring to.
Remember when I referenced the observer effect before? Remember when
So
I
right now,
referenced the
you're just talking
observer
about the
effect?
word burst. That's all your argument is that you use the word burst in the article there.
It's just annoying that you still can't concede, even though like what you're saying, your accretion model, you can't cite evidence for it. It's completely speculative. It's completely hypothetical, and you know it.
No, I could probably find you a paper or something on it. I mean,
You
it's
can find
basically.
me a paper, sure, filled with speculations. They will
I mean,
admit themselves that they 95% don't know what the hell's going on and can't account for the Hubble effect. My model accounts for the Hubble effect because you have temporal lensing. The time here adds up with the time everywhere else. There's really nothing to be afraid of. It's not no time or whatever you're thinking. It's just multiple time bubbles. So to believe that there's some sort of an absolute time, if there isn't, don't you think that's going to cause a problem with your conception?
um, I don't know. I don't really know how that relates to what we were talking about.
We were talking about a
Just feel
temporal
like the
causality.
stars is ridiculous, but I still don't understand how they relate.
We were trying to talk about stars and how they're formed and whose model has evidence for it. And mine does, and yours doesn't, that isn't laden with a bunch of suppositions. I've got direct evidence.
What's the direct evidence? Is it still the article headline? Because that's not good evidence.
Well, the evidence is the result of that investigation where they looked at a maximum density region and looked at it for long enough, and a star eventually precipitated from it based on the prediction that this is what would happen based on gravitational
Wait,
collapse. Are you
star
saying it's
form.
inconceivable that a star could form from a gravitational collapse and it wouldn't take that long for that to happen?
Okay, so I wasn't saying that all stars necessarily take millions of years.
Well,
Maybe
you
they do.
were saying that, and you would have been
Don't have
fine
to.
if I came. You would not have contested if I came to that conclusion. And now you're saying, okay, well, I'm open to it. It's okay. If you are open to it, what's the distinction? How do you know when a star is going to form by accretion or exclusion? Tell me that.
Accretion or exclusion.
Well, I've shoehorned my exclusion mechanism into it with an article here. And you're saying accretion's a model, and I'm saying, okay, how do you know when it's going to be one or the other? What are the observables that indicate one way or the other?
Well, I mean, there's neither necessarily ever going to occur. But if you want to look at a star and figure out how it's
There
formed,
is evidence in that article of exclusion occurring. Exclusion is a fast process. Quantum state exclusion, I don't want to say is instantaneous because action is never truly instantaneous, but
the
quantum
word
state
exclusion,
exclusion is built into matter itself.
the word exclusion doesn't appear in the article.
They said
I don't.
black hole bursts, okay? Black hole
Yeah,
bursts,
that's
quantum
just the
state
headline.
exclusion, that's the same thing. It's about the evidence, Moop. It's not about the interpretations of some randos. It's about what's the evidence telling
So
us.
it's still,
And
so
can we
still what your
interpret
evidence is
wisely?
the word bursts. Still, what your evidence is the word burst in the title of the article. That's your evidence.
That's pretty, I mean, almost synonymous with instantaneous. But if you want to go on a semantic digression and somehow say that, no, you were actually not saying that it takes millions of years for stars to form, and that's not what you earlier said, that's cool. We can move on from that. So what are we say? What are we at now? If that's temporal causality, how did time cause that?
Again,
Or was time caused in that?
I don't think that that's what temporality means, is being caused by time. No one really thinks that.
What do people think then?
Whether something is temporal, as I said earlier, is having a place in time or occupying some kind of like bit of time. That's what it means.
So then why is causality being invoked at all? I mean, do you honestly think that I think that you're telling the truth here?
What am I lying about? I don't understand what I'm lying about.
Well, the whole conversation is whether causality can be, is cause equal to time? Are all causes made into effects by time?
Well,
Or
I was
could
giving an example.
something else cause things? That's the question.
Yeah, so I mean, I was trying to give an example earlier about an example of causation that wouldn't necessarily occur over a period of time. but he didn't seem to
And
like it very much.
so
I'm
was
gonna leave.
I.
You know what, I'm gonna stop. This is gonna be my end of the the end of my contribution to the conversation. I think because I don't think you're making any sense as per usual, and any attempts I make to try and pin down like and understand what you're saying, you seem to just get annoyed and change the subject. So it's just really it's a very bizarre conversation. So I'm out.
Yeah.
Well, I'm fascinated, Jen.
Great. I'm glad you joined. Frankly, it's been a bit disheartening, but this always like that with this guy. And you can get the fuck off the stage now, asshole. The thing is that it would be really nice if like I'm giving these ideas a chance. I went to school for years in this, and I worked in the field for years in this. Okay.
Hey, sorry, hang on. Just in what field did you work?
I gave these ideas a fair shake.
What
I'm
field did you work
extremely,
in for years,
extremely
Jen?
generous.
Jen, you just shout. You're talking at me.
I'm not
Which
talking
field?
to you. I'm not talking to you. I'd like to address the audience just for a second. I
I'll
haven't
address the audience
started
then, and
talking.
then I
Is that
will
okay?
address your nonsense.
Well, that's not really getting it off to a great start.
Well, nor is okay. Carry on.
You
Apologies.
know, it's fine. I mean, I want to have a good. I think honestly, I have a pretty good rapport with most people, and I don't have any brothers. I have sisters, so I'm not really used to the whole thing. Pardon me. I have given these ideas due consideration. I'm not really interested in having stuff that I've read many, many, many times repeated back to me. It would be nice to go into ideas that people want to try to establish that ideas are true based on their own merits, not what they've memorized out of a book, which is fine to supplement knowledge. But if all you did was memorize something and now you're just vomiting out, it's like, yeah, you can probably bet that I've heard that before. And if I don't agree with it, I have a pretty damn good reason for not agreeing with it. And you don't need to agree with me, but to think that you're blathering some nonsense is going to change my mind or be anything other than a waste of time to my audience and yourself and me is delusional. But why don't you tell us your background before I go into mine? LSF.
Well,
And
my
your
background is really important. Excuse
what
me.
is your
Did you
interest?
ever breathe in?
What is your interest in this
Stop by
conversation?
breathing in. Hey, Jen, breathe in.
What is your interest in this conversation? Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I'm a physicist. Are you?
All right, and where'd you go to school?
Are you a physicist? Do you have qualifications in physics, preferably post-grad, MA plus? Go on, tell me.
I'd really
I don't
like
care where
you.
they came from.
I'd like you to finish qualifying your expertise.
I'm sure you would. Because all I've heard thus far is a load of garbage from you. So,
I
are you
guess this hasn't
qualified
happened in
in
a while.
physics, in mathematics, pure mathematics, anything related to that topic? Please answer me. Or are
Yes,
you
I'm
just
Flower.
another mouthy philosopher on Discord who thinks that they can answer and question physicists on their ideas about what were you talking? What did you say about causality being an aspect of being caused by time? I almost, my brain nearly ran out of my ears when you said it.
I don't think anyone
what's your
believes that you're
suggestion?
a physicist, for
Sorry.
starters.
Can we just clarify something? You were talking about star
Just don't
formation.
talk over me here. I talk. I
Okay.
need you to stop talking, and so that I can.
Yeah, and I need you to
follow
shut
my
the
own
fuck
train of
up
thought.
too, yeah. Cool, groovy. When you've quite finished with the clever, big, grandstanding staging stuff, I'm actually interested. So what's your idea that you can have an instantaneous, i.e. no temporal aspect of star formation? Where has that come from? Other than your science article.
Does it need to come from anywhere else if I can point to an article with the evidence substantiating it and you can't back anything up?
Oh, what?
You're saying-
Can't I back up now? You keep making accusations that no one can back anything up, and the only thing you've posted is a stupid colloquial article from a goddamn shitty science publication online. Where's the paper that goes with it? Cited. Et al. Everybody's involved.
Okay,
Referenced.
so
all-
you're the shitty Discord philosopher
No,
that
I'm a
that
fucking
quit
physicist,
before.
and you're a
That
stupid, dumb philosophy bitch. Now I am fucking sick of listening to this kind of shit.
That was a projection before, I guess. And I want you to come back. I honestly do. I had to put you in the audience for a second just to calm down. But, I like philosophy. Why do you think I did physics and all that work to eventually just do philosophy? It's awesome for me, I hope to continue these conversations for very long into the future, which will happen if things can remain nice and calm. Which maybe this is a really good example of why these topics, when it goes into consciousness, your probability of cognitive dissonance goes up. It's not ever going to be 100%. Unless you're so good at triggering it. That's another story. But once you're into consciousness, people have trouble, obviously, dealing with taking the quote objective, what seems to be an objective stance on something that has always been at the center of subjectivity, aka consciousness. All right, let's see here. Mea Culpa says, can you clarify whether you're in support or against the proposition of atemporal causality? Well, that's a great question. I would say it depends on the topic. Now, when we're looking at physics versus psychology, do you want to frame it, our causal understanding, identically? Probably not. Why? Because it's different domains. Are we going to accept the general notion that there are some causes and stuff happens, and then you get some effects? And then we have to furthermore answer, what is the best way to decompose the domain of observables such that we resolve our understanding, optimally resolve our understanding of causality? All right, I'm just going to check my comments. I'm just having such the hardest time with this computer. It keeps freezing. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Parisia says, no reason to go straight to credentialism. I actually don't like going to credentialism because it's, I don't want to say pedantic. I mean, that person obviously deserved it, but doesn't, I would like for people to say what brought them to a topic. That would be cool. If they're interested in giving that info. But to demand information like credentials, well, this isn't a job interview. Just an attempt to get someone on the back foot, really, and then you're just flat out of the domain of philosophy. Chad says, freak out from the British guy seemed unwarranted to me. Sure. The triggering is real. I mean, I had a feeling this was going to happen earlier. I was just like making a drink, and then I was like, huh. If I do this on the T-Jump server, it's probably going to, there's a good chance this is going to be contentious. But oh well. All right, so I'm trying to scroll through the comments. I haven't seen them all, and I can't tell if there are actually questions. So if anyone's still tuning in on YouTube, feel free to drop whatever questions in the chat before I wrap up, unless anyone raises their hand in the audience, and we can keep going. Tinkle asks, does cause and effect not happen without an observer? Observer effects are tied up in consciousness, which is pre-observation. And cause and effect, usually that gets mixed up with observation, which is mixed up with temporality, which is mixed up with the speed of light, which is why we have to stop, which is what this was all eventually hopefully coming to, was with properly defining the parameters based on domain and having that bring about as much information in advance of observation as is possible. All right, looks like can wrap it up. Okay, actually, I gotta check here. Oh, Moop, yes, you you had a bit of a hard time. It's a question of whether you can work with incomplete understanding. It's really what it boils down to. So, are you just gonna come on and try to reassert your existing beliefs and try to quote convince me that you're right? Probably going to be a waste of both of our time. I did actually write an article about this, and I'll go through it here. This is what I was hoping we could get to in the chat, but it never happened. Just make sure that it's actually screen sharing. And incredibly encouraging comments there. I did not study psychology. I enjoy studying it perhaps as a hobbyist. How could you possibly get complete understanding without first working with incomplete understanding? Well, Daryl, I don't think you're, I don't really think there's any way for me to explain that in a way that anyone's going to understand at this time. And hopefully it'll be self-evident at some point in all of our lives. Temporality, I was trying to get to before, it's ongoing. And how can we establish that it's ongoing? Is the fact that we can do this, not just carbon dating, but radiometric dating in general. This idea that the age of a star can be not just a star, but planets as well, inferred from its emission and absorption spectrum. And that's very, very important. It tells us that temporality is itself temporary because it can be established to have a beginning. And according to physics, anything with beginning has an end, blah, blah, blah. And someone from Discord's asking what my degree is in. Cum laude, physics math. Honors degree from University of Ottawa. I appreciated a lot of what I learned there. And agree with a lot of it as well. Yeah, and you were describing different concepts. And the point wasn't to describe different concepts, it was to go into the concept of atemporal causality itself, which we never got to, which was a touch frustrating because you don't appear to have any background in this quantum, at least not any relevant background at all. And I guess it's good because now we know what other positions are. We don't know what they can establish. No one was, I think maybe the triggering things finally fell apart when nobody could give any evidence of time actually causing any change. So at best we could do was that time was co-arising, but it sure as heck felt like time was causing the change. But even then we couldn't agree on that because it just seemed at some point to be really a disagree off a lot of levels. Interesting stuff though. Nice to see you, Krishna Krishna. Thanks for joining. Appreciate it. The question of causation and the question of atemporal versus temporal causality are different. And I should have made that clear, I guess. To me, it seems like things are constantly being dragged into a domain where it's possible to cast doubt on what's being said. You can try to say that that's wrong and that people are actually coming with an open mind. But I guarantee you, neither of these clowns has read anything I've written and has, if anything, tried their damnedest not to understand what I was saying. And only to double down on asserting that though we may disagree on many things, temporal causality wasn't one of them. And then there was a bit of a challenge in just sort of describing even what that meant. But anyway, back to what we can actually establish. I want to be really clear here, difference between observations, empirical observations, aka uncontested, least contested aspects of experiments versus latter-day nonsensical, possibly explanations of phenomena that the main pundits admit doesn't predict 95% of the phenomena. Purifying Flame says people can idolize the master of a subject, but the master can't idolize what they've mastered. All right, let's try to stay on temporal versus atemporal causality here. Daryl, we both know that you love what I'm saying. That's why you listen to all my shows. So just stop with the shit posting here, Daryl. It's just honestly a waste of time. So I've gone through this in detail, and I don't really want to take up too much time going over this probably very long article. But what we have evidence of and what it seems like based on our sensory experiences aren't the same thing. So what I was hoping with this exchange was that we could talk about what can be established with evidence. And we weren't able to establish much with evidence. And then it turned into, and then now it's funny because there's like, I would call this gaslighting in the chat. It kind of reminds me of what Claire Kaw does. I really don't care about your interpretations of the exchange. What I care is, did you actually bother to think about any of these ideas? And it really doesn't seem like anybody did. So it's a very simple model. It's like borderline ridiculously simple how fundamentally like hard-headed you'd have to be to not understand it at this point. But there you go. That's how it is. People are used to arguing about things within a particular range of ideas. And to go outside of that range makes people very afraid and uncomfortable. And that's the reason why you calm yourself down. You don't allow yourself to become emotional when you're dealing with these subjects. You sort of understand, well, if the conscious effects are going to be part of this, I better calm my consciousness down and not be getting all triggered when I can't establish an example of temporal causality and it proves that I don't even know what the fuck I'm talking about. And I'm trying to undermine someone else's credibility in physics, but I couldn't even begin to establish even the theories that I'm citing as self-evident general relativity to establish some other domain adjacent thing that couldn't even begin to be asserted as true. Now, I'm glad that you don't know how it's coherent to say planets formed quantum. Your feelings don't matter. What matters is what you can establish with evidence. Let's focus away from the feeling and onto the evidence. How do you feel about the quality of evidence? That's what I do. I say, how do I feel about the periodic table? Not how can I imagine a world in my head that may or may not be real, that I can then feel some weird type of egotistical muscle flex by flapping my lips about it. That belongs in a sewing circle, not philosophy discussion group. All right. Main thing we really want to focus on is an utter inability to account for this. Oh, like, like forming an accretion, Okay. That means they were sort of like slowly, kind of like imagine, okay, when I think accretion, I think of like, oh, what are they, so cotton candy? It's like, okay, well, is there wind that's causing the accretion? Gravity? Okay, well, why wasn't it accreted before? And I was like, what is basically, where's all this matter that we can measure coming from? Because most of the matter in the universe isn't measurable in the way we would normally think of things as measurable, i.e., involving light. So, what does it mean to really measure something, which is another topic I really wanted to get onto, which was the observer effect and how light works with the observer effect. Notice how we didn't get to that at all, because we would have had to agree, first of all, on the initial framing, which we never got to agreeing on the initial framing. Which is funny that people say in the chat, like, oh, I wanted to agree with Jen. It's like, okay, citation needed, because that seemed like you were going basically around the world just to not agree with me on a minor technicality. Like, just think about this. It went from stars are formed instantly. It went from stars are formed by accretion over a long period of time. Of course, that didn't even get said, but stars are formed over a long period of time too. Oh, well, actually, no, stars can be formed like maybe really quickly in a burst, but that burst is not instant. So let's think here. We've got instantaneous burst, whatever the hell a burst is. I don't even bother checking. I assume it's fast. Okay, instantaneous 1, burst 2, millions of years 3. Okay. Those are your options. Well, the evidence is pretty close to instantaneous. Not saying it was instantaneous. I just say that, like, let's admit that this model can't account for the ages of the planets being the same. And just move on. And Daryl is still there. So glad Daryl's still here to riff off me. And those occur over time. No, that's the beginning of time. Here. Okay. So here, where we are right now, did not have this type of existence. The matter here, yeah, sure, that exists forever. Matter can't be created or destroyed, but it wasn't in the same state. So temporality is a state of matter. That's really important. And this is where we have to ignore our intuitions. Because our intuitions are built up around temporality co-arising with causality. So obviously it'd be easy to think to switch or to equate them. But if we want to understand past an individual solar system, we have to understand that that impression is vestigial. So the way to interpret these data is to say that time started at the same time as space. Again, time is the wrong word. Time and space had a co-arising when they were excluded from another region. And my article is an example of such an exclusion, which occurs due to gravitational collapse, which is atemporal causality, because the cause of that collapse is just gravity. But apparently took an hour and 38 minutes to get to the point of just actually saying that, because of several semantic digressions, as well as a quite angry individual, which I thought was rather, I don't want to say hilarious, but I guess I'm happy that I didn't get dragged into it too much. Okay, so I don't hate you, Quantum. I would like to progress the conversation forward rather than enable you to continue indulging in your own vices. You can indulge your own vices with anyone, but maybe you could try to indulge in a little. I'm not saying you have to agree with me, but maybe see what it is that I'm kind of saying or how it's being framed or what it would take to understand it. Because honestly, some of these things they do take quite a while. Like to understand consciousness, that's going to take a while. Understand a couple things tangential to consciousness and move towards a deeper understanding over time. And eventually, you'll see that there's an intrinsic limitation to understanding that relative to your initial perception of the topic limits your understanding within that topic, but also opens the door for more study. So it always comes back to this metaphor of it's a cheesy elephant metaphor where different domains of knowledge build up to a single perspective on the elephant, but you still don't have the full elephant by having a single domain of knowledge. Daryl asks, is karma real and temporal? Karma is the concept of causality. So to say that karma is true is to say that one is accepting a principle, a general principle, some type of a causal principle. And there could be different causal principles, and one could invoke a dualistic separation, say a cause and effect. I say you need a trinity separation. You need a cause, the effect, and a mediator in order for it to be a minimum degree of consistency or coherency or however you want to word it. All right, I'm just working my way around to sharing this article before we wrap it up. Really appreciate the people tuned in. It's great. I hope this is useful and that the extremely negative Nancys, who shall remain unnamed, aren't dragging the vibe down too much. Let's see here. Mea culpa would be interested in having a conversation, but not about the topic at hand. Are you in the audience right now? If you want to come up, we can change the topic, or we can talk a different time. Either way is fine with me. I'm just hanging out. It's a great time. What's up, Easy Rider? Nice to see you, man. I know Daryl's not going to come up and chat with me. Okay, Mea culpa is going to come up. Sweet. All right, let's see what's going on. Daryl says no point. Daryl, come on, man. What kind of an attitude is that? Well, easy. You're gonna be done work real soon. Then it's the weekend, right? So we can pick it back up on the weekend. I love these combos. It went to shit. Okay, like veered off the edge of reasonability a little bit with Poopinator, and then it just went complete dumpster dumpster fire. It just turned into a complete rager then, but I put him in the audience because I want to have inner peace, and that is something I look forward to. Okay, so back to this idea. The fact that causality and we've got our participant, Mea culpa. Welcome. Can you is your audio coming through? Just do a test. Awesome. Coming through. Daryl, perhaps if you said something worthy of discussion, something that made sense and is interesting. I don't want to give you a false sense of understanding. That's the last thing I want.
Is this actually working?
It sounds good to me. You're a little low, but should be fine.
Yeah, my headset may be a little far from my mic. So, what I'm actually curious about here, so let me establish that I'm not a physicist by any measures whatsoever. I love listening to conversations like this because I find them fascinating. And I kind of tuned in just to, you know, just put an ear to it, right? Because I love learning. So it's always interesting to learn something new, especially if you don't know what's going on, you know. But I am a developmental psychologist from Western Michigan University. I currently work in IO psychology. I don't know if that means anything to you, but what I'm actually really curious about is I'd like to get your take on how you may think, and maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but um, if by like atemporal causality and temporal causality, um, if I understand what you're implying with that particular lingua, I'm curious as to what you think that may be having an effect on current instantiation of uh, politics and the world around us right now, and how we're like interpreting um, current events, right? Uh-oh.
I'm sorry, my thing froze up. Are you still there?
Yeah, I just patiently.
Thank you for waiting. Okay, just if I can summarize your questions, you say, are you asking what I think the effect of believing in temporal causality is on political effects?
Right. Yeah. So because and perhaps this is due to my own ignorance on the subject, but I wasn't quite sure when I asked if whether or not you were for or against the presumptive or the idea of like an atemporal causality being like an established like a realm of fact, or just sort of like an idea, you know. But
I, I
I'm
think
just
it's,
curious on those things, like
I
what
mean,
you
it
think.
seems, don't you think it seems like time is the cause of change?
Yeah, I would agree in a lot of ways. I personally, I ascribe to a causal temporality.
I mean, I don't think anybody would disagree that it feels like time causes change.
Hmm. See, one of
Now
one of the
that
interesting
I
things.
like that's the part I don't want to dispute about that. The question is, can we prove that in a
Can you
way
establish?
that is not self-referential? Like we don't want it to be appealing to our own impression of things. I mean, that's something that can inform how we understand things. Like if our only way of understanding things is temporal causality, then that's what we're stuck with, even if it's wrong. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So one
I
interesting
don't
side
think we
note
are
on that.
bound.
Yeah.
I don't think
One
we
one.
are bound to temporal causality myself, but maybe it's a fact. I don't know.
Well, I mean, so for okay, so one of the interesting things about this is that cognitively, when your brain determines events and the procedures of events, it's actually quite confusing because the experience of the event is not consistent with the actual procession of events as it would be recorded from an extrajudiciary observer, right? So, like, if I was watching you, here's a really simple example of this. Um, if me and you were standing next to each other, and I reached out and poked you on the shoulder, the way that I interpret that event unfolding is that I would watch my fingers go to your shoulder. I would touch you, and then after I touched you, you would react. Um, but I'm sorry, that's the opposite. Um, you would actually react before my finger touched your body, but in your mind, you you completely resituate those processions of events um, by mixing up the two at the end, where you actually believe that
I need to
you
stop you because I'm completely lost. What are you talking about here?
what
Where's
I'm
this
saying
going?
is what I'm saying is that if somebody comes in contact with you or something comes in contact with you as a person, right? Um, the interpretation in your brain.
Are you saying if someone touches me, like where? What? I don't understand. Like, where is this going? I'm so confused.
Well, if you give me a moment to unpack it, I can tell you. Just give me a second.
Can you
Right.
just tell me the conclusion so that the explanation makes more sense in advance of? It's just
Well, in
so
order for me to get to
confusing.
the conclusion, I have to give you the explanation. That's kind of the point, right? Uh, it's not too confusing, but literally all it is that when you interact with the world around you, your brain switches around certain events in order
You're
for it to make more
presupposing
cognitive.
you're presupposing that the brain is the originator of consciousness. Can't
I don't,
establish that.
there's no necessary presupposition here.
You're
This is
also
actually an
presupposing
established.
that you know how the brain modifies consciousness, and you don't. The mind is the modifier of consciousness. So right off the bat, I wouldn't agree with any of the interpretations that you had because I know why they're wrong. Now, I don't know what this has to do with atemporal causality, but yeah, you said you want to talk about psychology. What specifically about psychology do you want to discuss?
This is an established. This is an established realm of psychology, in a realm of neuroscience. When you're speaking about
Psychology is the
perceptual,
logic of how people behave.
when you're
If you
speaking
can't
about
predict how people behave, then that's not psychology.
when you're talking about the processional understanding and interpretation of events, this is like this is basic. This is not a. I'm not. There's no presumptive claim here. Truly, your brain purposefully purposefully reorders events for your own ability to
Okay.
maintain.
So what?
Right.
What are you getting at here?
Well, the idea is that if you have when actually I was kind of agreeing with you, to be honest, um, that when you have causality, when you're talking about causal effect, right? Your brain doesn't necessarily, almost rarely ever actually interprets events in the correct procession. So when you were talking about the observer effect and how those things actually act in the world of physics, right, which I'm assuming is what you meant, um, this is it's easily established within the frame of our own minds, right? We do this all the time. We don't actually see things the way that they're happening. It's it's very easily established. Like this is like a not a
That
claim even.
Sure, yeah, but that I don't see how you go from that to causality. Um, what's the connection, or what's the connection from? Or sorry, you said psychology. What's the connection from that to psychology?
I mean, I thought I had just fairly well established it. Causality being the procession of events, right? One thing leading to another thing. The problem is that in our minds we don't
The
even perceive
perception of events,
causality.
the,
Yeah,
the perception of events
I said a
and
procession.
causality aren't the same. Oh, you
I
said
said
procession,
procession. Yes. Yeah.
procession of events,
Yes.
as in them proceeding.
As in one thing following another.
Sure, that's causality.
Right. Right. Yes. My
And
point. That's my entire point. Right.
and your
Is that
point is that causality applies to psychology?
my point is that your brain is a byproduct of physics as well. So when we're
Sure.
looking at things, when we're observing things in the universe, we're observing the world around us. Um, Causality doesn't really apply to our mental state the same way that it does to the world around us. Right? So we don't observe things in the correct order of events that they're actually happening um, in the external universe around us.
And you're saying that in the external universe, they are happening objectively, quote
Well,
unquote.
well, as objectively as we could tell, right? So what I was actually asking you, what I was curious about was what you think. Do you think that the same sort of mix up of events that happen in our internal monologue of the world may also be happening with the external monologue of how we see and observe the universe around us? Is that kind of what you were trying to say with the like the observer effect? Like, do you think that that's really what that's supposed to be?
What you're saying is true. That was not what I meant by the observer effect.
Okay.
I'll tell you why what you're saying is true, because we create modifications to the material realm that's completely uncontested. modifications we impose upon the material realm, there's, you know,
Modification. What do you mean by modification?
like I can build a house. That's a modification of material
Sure.
realm. If I believe that a house must be built a certain way, all my houses will reflect that template. What I believe determines the modifications. If I'm civilization,
Well, I mean, is it necessarily I don't know if it's necessarily a modification, more just a restructuring, right? I mean, you're
this
not
is
changing.
essentially this is a
It's
semantic
semantic.
distinction.
Of course, it's
There's really
semantics,
no
but
distinction. We're
most
saying the
things
same
there
thing.
is. There is like a restructuring versus a modifying. A modification of something implies that you're changing some kind of essential characteristic of something, whereas a restructuring or a reorganization is entirely different. I mean, semantics are important. I mean, they absolutely play a role in these kinds of conversations, even though they may seem sort of sometimes they seem
Then
pedantic.
modifications is the correct word because it's more general, because chemical reactions are modifications, not restructurings.
Sure, sure. I mean, I think building a house probably is not the best word to use for that. Then, I mean, putting
It's more like well, I
making
think
a
it's a
new
more
chemical
relatable,
compound.
it's a more relatable example. The point of the example is not to get on that type of digression, is to say that beliefs create the
Mhm.
form of civilization.
Sure, sure. But
Believe
again,
certain
like
If we believe that circles are really important, then our math will be full of circles. But if we believe squares are
right,
really important, our math will be full of squares. That doesn't necessarily say anything about the quote objective reality of circles or squares in and of itself. We may be able to deduce those things with more information, but in and of itself doesn't say anything, right?
so
It's
are
just
you
like a possible worlds thing.
well, I mean, I suppose mathematics is full of geometric shapes because geometric shapes are fairly universal, right? It's very distinguishable. So we look at things and we see geometric shapes.
That can't be established. It only seems like it can be established.
So is the idea then that a geometric shape is not a universal at all?
It seems like it ought to be, but the
Right, right,
conditions which make it that are themselves subjective, and you can't
right.
really
Ought
get
to
out
be
of
doesn't
subjective
necessarily.
thing.
Yeah, yeah. Correlation doesn't mean. Yeah, yeah. I mean that's a fair point, right? I wonder then how any sort of like sufficiently advanced alien, civilization, if they were actually in existence, um, would then interpret geometric symbolism. I wonder if it would actually mean anything to them at all.
I've been
Uh,
trying to resolve this because I've been looking, and historically, like ever since the Pythagorean theorem, there's this subliminal sociocultural belief that reality somehow runs on an engine of mathematics.
yeah, yeah. That's
It's
interesting.
it's such a
Uh,
strong feeling. It's part of the ethos to an insane degree that we've only really begun to understand, I think. I haven't really thought about this idea too much. I'm just sort of starting to go into it, but
yeah, yeah. The ideological construct. So we live under our fucking bone chilling, to be honest.
you
Um,
asked a really good question before, and I don't think I can answer it in its current form. But one thing I can say that's like tangential to it is, if you believe in the beginning of the universe, we are currently in the present. We are as far from the beginning as possible, which makes us at the end due to our conceptual limitations, making metaphysical equivalencies very easily.
mhm.
That creates, in my opinion, apocalyptic fetishism. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's actually a fairly interesting concept. From my experience with dealing with people, what I find is that most yeah, to use your terminology, apocalyptic fetishism, um, usually tends to revolve around the instantiation of religions in the first place, right? Like religions and just that sort of dogmatic thinking, like almost an anti-progressive thinking, right? So it's like, if you take like Christianity, for instance, and not to be offensive to anybody because there's no point in doing that at all, but um, you know, it's interesting how much root we have in bygone understandings of the universe, and how much that affects uh, how we interpret the world around us. And we almost seem to look forward to the apocalypse, as if it's the culmination of all things that have progressed so far, of all events, right? It's like, and it's almost an alleviating sort of thing to take away the underlying thoughts that precede us, that we have no real control anyway, right? Most people ascribe to a psychology, or to prescribe to a religion, because uh, typically, from my experience, out of fear of not having any sort of replicatable control. You can't
I
certain
think
things
I think
away.
fear of death. I think fear of
Yes.
death is the basic animal fear, and that we all have an animal component, and that
Oh yeah,
that's totally fine. And if we ignore it, we're going to run into problems. But in and of itself, it's just a fact. Fact.
yeah, but yeah, to base one's whole life around it is sort of like the first instantiation of religion. If you look back at like totemism, for instance, fear of mortality and man's ultimate cease, to exist. Um, the cessation of all consciousness typically tends to be what most people revolved all of their religious thoughts around. You know, and the hope that by ascribing to this particular belief system, we could sort of route around that, right? To transcend that incomprehensible uh, cessation of existence. And that's a deeply fascinating subject to me. Uh,
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear your thoughts. And so to come back to this beginning, did you understand my argument about the beginning of the universe versus the end of the universe? And
I mean, as much as I can. I mean, I'm trying to both interpret it from
what
my
I'm
limited
trying to say
physics
is like
understanding, right? And also like a sort of anthropological understanding as well.
I would say think of it like two options: uncreated or created universe.
Sure.
I'm
Mm.
saying that it's uncreated.
Yeah, I don't think I heard this interesting argument once, and I say interesting not because I think it's valid, but interesting, just people's thoughts are interesting to me. And I think there's always room to listen to more people think, because there's a lot to be found within the confines of other people's minds. But this, I heard this theory once, and I'm paraphrasing, of course. I couldn't hope to get this right. Um, but it was something around the lines of that this idea that because a God is conceptually possible, um, then God necessitates a causal backpedaling chain of events that lead eventually to God, right? And that God, since God, a deific figure of that magnitude, would have to exist outside of the sort of the quatrain of this universe, so to speak, and the confines of it therein, that there would have to be a necessary stopgap right there, at God. So that would be the progenitor, right? Which I don't necessarily agree with. I don't think that anything that exists causes the presumptive nature of a necessary existence, right? Which is what they were trying to establish, was that God was a necessary existence, therefore God would have to be the progenitor, or the maker of all things, which is strange to me. I don't see how they would lead back to that.
That is the essential religious belief. Like if you're
Right.
sold on that, if you're sold that the concept of God is valid for the purpose of organizing your thoughts, then you oak it and believe it as the ground of being.
Yeah. Yeah,
Or
that's
you could just say there's an existence, it's self subsistent, and it's suffused with consciousness, and that is its nature, whatever you want to call it. I think you can get around God. In
yeah.
theory, I don't know if in practice you can, but it's a different question.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on that's really the issue, right? Is religion touches more on philosophy and the deeply semantical claims than people like to admit, I think. it's incredibly subjective, and it's because I mean it's just so difficult to nail down to any effect what God is supposed to be. I mean, there's definition,
Well, who's
but
in a position to say who God is supposed to
right,
be?
yeah, exactly.
We
It's
don't
very
even know if that question makes sense. Like, if there is a God and we call it who, and what if that turns out to be the most fucking offensive thing that has ever existed? Like, what if it turns out that saying that ends up with, we get a curse from that? Because God's like, I have no who-ness. How dare you? I'm just
right,
kidding.
almost
I don't think God would be that pedantic.
like
That level of
the pronoun name for God. Yeah,
that level of pedantry, I think, is reserved exclusively for humans. Daryl says the beginning of everything would be something without a cause, and what could cause an end? So it is causality, not cycles. Causality is cyclic, Daryl. There's no preferred orientation to any of it. That's why we can say we're in the middle, because everywhere in the universe is the middle, because it doesn't have a boundary. And that's good, because the alternative to that is we're at the end of the universe in a perpetual boneyard of apocalyptic weirdo.
I think it'd be really hard to establish just strict linearity, though, wouldn't it? I mean, it's basically it's really difficult to establish linearity in almost anything. Uh, it's hard to establish linearity in your own
Linearity
thoughts.
linearity can't be established. It can be established in a single quote moment. I don't mean a moment as in a delta t, because in order to make an observation, you need a delta time, you need a delta observable. I'm just talking about a mere instantiation of an observable. This is not, this is like part of a measurement. A measurement always requires two observables either end of an observation. It's a very specific point, right?
No,
Do you know A versus B theory of time?
no, I do not personally.
I won't
Oh,
even
yeah,
go into it. It doesn't matter if you don't, if you're not familiar with it, it's fine.
yeah. I may have heard it somewhere and listening to a video or something, but definitely not enough to speak anything about it. As yeah, I would just sound like a fucking idiot.
Linearity is more important anyway, so
Mm,
we can't establish linearity in anything other than the A theory of time, aka moment to moment. So in a given moment, not an observation, first step of an observation, you can establish a line. But by the time you got to the end of that observation, if it's a non-trivial observation, right? If it actually changes in any way the waveform heat content, and that's how it's going to go.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that because in psychology, the way that we would establish this is like um, linearity has to be encapsulated, right? So like, in order for you to progress in a chain of thoughts, you have to be able to necessarily encapsulate um, and contain that string of thoughts um, so that it's impervious to any sort of outside interference, which is why we don't have linear thought.
Holy shit, we should try to prove that linear thoughts create a truth explosion. And it leads to having infinity thoughts. Or
I
that
don't,
every thought has zero energy. That's the problem with mental stuff, is either you end up with infinity thoughts, which implies that every thought has either zero or almost zero energy, which makes no sense. Or you end up with like, yeah, infinity energy in the mind, which also makes no sense.
I wish I would love to. I mean, if I could write a paper like that, it would be fantastic. I don't. I mean, I don't. Well, I don't think we
I
have enough
think you could.
established.
I
Uh,
think you could, because you have a mind for it. You just have to really go into the ideas, see how you feel about them, and then you will be able to like see past the current. There's a lot of questions, the way they're phrased or framed, it can't be answered in that particular framing. But if you change the framing a little bit, you can get maybe like 70% of the answer. And that's another part of this
yeah,
analysis technique that frustrates a lot of people and I think leads to a lot of contentiousness, is that the answers are always partial, but they're still optimized. And that's
sure.
because you're living in a very complicated universe that cannot ever be fully decomposed. And isn't that kind of good?
Yeah. One of the problems with writing writing papers of any sort or of caliber in psychology or any sort of one of the soft sciences, I suppose, is that there's almost nothing that's like concretely. Like there's almost nothing that's concretized, right? So you end up with this. Um,
Well, you in psychology, you want something concrete in psychology?
yeah, it's like it's a really
Everybody spontaneously simulates a sense of a localized self. And they
yeah,
have
yeah.
predictable ranges of behavior that do change between people based on their dispositions and humors, but that have a very general profile that apply broad strokes to people who either have or haven't done training techniques to overcome these tendencies. So there are ways
Yeah, but
to get
so
behind subjectivity, I think.
sure, sure. Well, one of the problems though is like, for instance, I have friends who are in chemistry, right? And to read a chemistry paper, um, it's relatively short. To write a psychology paper, it's extensive. It's so huge. Like it's massive because you have to every single. It's sort of like you're crawling your way up, like just clawing at the side of a mountaintop. You're just like progressively trying to get there, and everything has to be nailed down within the confines of that paper because there's so much room for nuance. Right? And it's one of those problems, right? Like, so I could attempt to make the argument that you could have this sort of like an exponentially growing, ever increasing field of thought, which there are some theories that kind of touch on that, but they mostly delve into the field of like very experimental fields of psychology and things of that nature, where you almost get into like a metaphysical sort of understanding of the consciousness of the mind, and how those things are kind of portrayed. One instance of that would be when people talk about psychedelic experiences, and they venture into the realm of speaking about multidimensional experiences that they have, right? Um, that one issue with those is that if your mind is able to conceptualize of these things, that they must have some instantiation somewhere, right? Your mind doesn't just draw from nothingness; it has to draw from something, right?
Are you saying this
Uh,
is, I have a question. Would you classify this argument as essentially Platonic?
like a Platonic theory.
I'm not saying I disagree. I'm interested in it. I'm just wondering if, like, on what basis are we saying that these constructs have reality, or we're just sort of assuming, yeah, there is some type of reality because we're accessing them.
Well, that's not necessarily what I'm arguing. I'm saying that this is sort of the claim that they have to make. Like one of the issues, like I'm just highlighting one of the issues of like making psychological claims of any sort, is that it often tends to trail off into these things where you have to make these like sort of loose, vague assumptions about the world and how the nature of how things would have to work, right? Because of certain other things that trail back from what we understand, but then it's an ever evolving field. So there's like almost nothing that's like concretized um, within the realm that can't be changed. For instance, like mathematics tends to largely be, from my experience, something that's relatively concrete. Like we understand certain things that make logical, consistent sense, but within psychology it's not as easy to establish that logical sort of consistency of things because things change so quick. There's nothing that's immutable. um, but if I were to argue that, I suppose what I would say is that it would be difficult to imagine, not to say impossible, difficult to imagine in my mind or conceptualize uh, the ability for your mind to draw from to make inferences or draw from something that has no basis in any reality. um, I then I would have to also positionally hold this idea that your mind is not limited to the corporeal instantiation of you right here, right now, in this particular, permutation of the universe. But that's a whole nother, again, that's like delving all the way down to the rabbit hole of shit. like you have to get really deep, you know.
How about this? Our consciousness simulates expected values of the future on different levels. It
Example.
simulates the expected value of the past by assembling a series of images, and there's evidence of that from eyes scanning sideways when
Sure.
they look at people's faces, and there's actually evidence that there's like, quote, direct evidence that there is an actual reconstructed image from several
Oh yeah,
seconds into
yeah,
the
yeah.
past, like 15 seconds.
Yeah, when
So the
performing
idea is
scans over in Japan, they've established these sort of things where you conjure an image. It's often not very accurate, but you do kind of conjure a reassembled image similarly to the way that computers when rescaling in computer imaging works. Something similar to that.
sampling.
Yeah, yeah.
You are
That,
sampling the environment, and then you are simulating the environment as well as the meta environment, aka the
right,
future.
right.
The
And there
possible
are
variations of the present are also simulated, not for everybody, but I assume you've
sure.
had thoughts about the future given the fact you can engage with these ideas on this level.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be an abstract thinker to engage in the soft sciences, I think, in general. um, one interesting thing from what you just said, I've thought about quite a bit is the idea that in order for you to engage in a thought that may be suggestive of a differing timeline from what you currently are experiencing, right? Like a divergence of that timeline, right? Um, means that in some way, shape, or form, there must be a version of yourself that is in that alternate timeline. Um, given that if there is if there's causality, right? If there is this like linear chain of events of any sort of thing, there's this like this sort of like how would you put this like this interwoven web of linearity, I suppose, which sounds strange, but I think
We
maybe
don't
you
want
can
to presuppose that when we talk about causality.
right,
Causality just
right.
means that there is a chain going from one to the other, and it's actually more of a cycle than a line. This is where you don't want to assume linearity because linearity is not true here.
Well, if we only if we boil down linearity to just being like you had said, like a moment to moment, right? So like you experience a form of
That's
linearity in your own
causality.
mind, right?
Moment to moment is causality. Causality is just the progression of things going from the where
Sure,
they
sure.
are to where
But
they're going to be.
what I'm suggesting is that from the experience point of view, right? Um, if you don't detect, if your mind isn't capable of looking grandly enough down the road um, at things, or trying to project itself into the future far enough, uh, even a winding, curving road can appear to be straight because you can't see far enough ahead. So,
Yeah,
so I
that's a
guess
very
from a
important point, is that
yeah, so from an
straight
experience
lines
point of view, it can appear to be linear, which is kind of the
straight
problem.
lines no, straight lines appear everybody can agree that a straight line appears to exist. But then
Sure.
to establish linearity as an actual concept outside of our perceptions, that's where the problems start.
Right, right, right. But this is like I said, this is kind of where it bumbles off into things that I guess I consider would have to be woo woo, right? When I think about it like that, because although these
No,
ideas
it's a
can
matter of using the right.
somewhat
It's just a matter of using the right theory. So I think what you're experiencing right now is maybe cognitive dissonance. Like you're not familiar with the idea, so it's kind of has like a weird feeling associated with it. Like, what does that mean? That you know, I don't know what it is exactly that seems weird about this stuff, but I don't, or nor do I understand how that is woo woo. To me, it's just necessary to account for consciousness, and maybe the woo woo step is like necessary. So it's like, okay, yeah, it's really hard. So we want to use the model that's correct, so we don't have to keep thinking about this really difficult concept.
oh no, I'm not lost in the concepts that you're pitching. I'm not lost in the ideas that you're discussing for. What I'm doing is I'm painting a hypothetical situation in which if I was arguing for the capacity for the mind to not be able to for an individual being able to conceptualize things outside of the realm of the already observed, um, that you would have to necessarily go down this route, um, some route similar to this, because there's no proof within the pudding, so to speak, to substantiate it. Right?
Uh,
I can't prove that your mind has to reach into another a multiverse or something, in order to instantiate these things. I can say that what you said about the experiments done with our ability to sort of reconfigure faces based on uh, the faulty memory banks of our mind does lead some credence to the idea that we have some creative capacity within our brain. I think one of the problems that I have is when it comes to when it comes to like if I was to think about this from maybe a religious perspective, right? I think one of the problems that people have with not having a creation, so for instance, um, and without that linear approach to like the causality, right? Like that you have to have that like chain of events that happens, and it's always this way, and there's a creator God sort of thing. But you end up with people who can't function under a model which says that they have the ability to function independently without the necessity of like a connective weave of thoughts that's the progenitor from someone else, right? Like it's really hard for people, I think, to do that. That's what I've experienced in practice.
Are you saying
With
that
people.
this linear thinking thing is extremely comforting?
Yeah, for sure, 100%. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a pretty good way of putting it.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
comforting, but it also seems to be necessary to some people, right? It's um one of the things that you'll notice is that when you're dealing with like you had suggested cognitive dissonance, right? One of the issues that people tend to have is that it's well, there's a Dunning-Kruger effect, for instance, where I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but I imagine that you are.
I wrote an article about it. I like to always mention to people when I discuss it that it has two main effects. One is less intelligent people overestimating their abilities, and more intelligent people being filled with doubts because the inhibition is actually predictive in some sense of the
Right.
intellectual and imaginative ability.
Yeah, the age old understanding that with more knowledge could oftentimes comes more questions, and obviously more questions begets more doubt because it's just more things you're aware that you don't know, and there's a prerequisite to not knowing, right? And I think that's lost on a lot of people too. It tends to make people very aggravated, right? Like you said, there tends to be a lot of contention around certain issues. It's because to some people, not understanding something is akin to being insulted. It's like, you know, in the scientific community, we don't do that. You
It's
know,
funny because it's the exact opposite. To me, if I was like giving this condescending, fake, overly simplified explanation, and they were like, "Oh yeah, I get it," at the end, that would be the insulting to their intelligence. Telling them, "Yeah, I think you're not getting this," that to me is respecting their intelligence. But or I guess you're sort of agreeing with me that there's maybe cultural differences between some of these fields.
uh, yeah, to some degree. I mean, well, you can always tell somebody who's genuinely educated, I think, and who's probably more apt to say genuinely curious about a subject and is interested in learning. Because like from the very moment of this conversation, the first thing I established was like, hey, I'm not a physicist. I don't know these things, and without a doubt a wealth of individuals who'd be much more competent at speaking about certain things I'm about to touch on than I would be. Infinitely more qualified. I don't have all those answers. I have no idea. I'm just sort of like making guesswork and out of my own ability to comprehend the material as it's being laid out to me, right? And that's all you can really expect to do. Um, I don't, appeals to authority are sort of silly in a lot of ways, but there is some engagement of that within the scientific community when you're having, especially when you're having a conversation or debate with somebody.
I like to
It's really
go into the
important.
I love to go into the question of authority because I believe that reasoning always necessitates points of authority acceptance,
Yeah, yeah. Well,
but
there's
not necessarily people. Like, for
mm,
example, you could say chemistry accepts, the authority of materialism on
right.
some, abstract level.
Well, there's a methodology to education that necessitates some sort of appeal to the efficaciousness of authority, right?
I don't
Um,
think that this is actually taught. The concept of authority is sort of vague. It's peer
right.
review, and that's about it. But
Sort of
really,
garnered.
authority is like you can think of it just in an autonomous sense. Like when you reason, you are deferring to the legitimacy of the authority of a particular reasoning strategy. So if I'm going to do math, I'm going to say, okay, well, accept the authority of I provisionally accept the authority of the uh, vector space axioms, etc.
That's
It's
that's
just
the
a
perfect word that you just used, right? Provisionally, right? I think people get hung up on there's a difference between appeal to authority. Like if you came out the gate and you just said, "I'm a mathematician, therefore listen to everything that I say," as if it's sheer doctrine truth, it's not the same thing as suggesting that there is a model or a concept that's available for these things that's established and well understood, and there's a lot of peer-reviewed science to back this up. Therefore, it would probably be in your best interest to take this um, with at least a modicum of reverentiality. You know what I mean? Like to be respectful and mindful of the fact that this has a lot of people backing it and a lot of thought backing it, right? Which doesn't necessarily say it's always true and that it can't be proven false, but it's also not without its merit. And so when you said provincially, that's the perfect fucking word for it.
And I'm trying to get a general concept across that all domains provisionally refer to authority, and that when it is not acknowledged that this is what is happening, it is a big problem.
Yeah, it sort of leads into a catastrophic kind of conversation. It's hard to progress in a conversation where people are engaging in well, how do I want to put this? When
Authority
they're not,
undermining?
yeah, well, yeah, I mean, maybe that, but I think it's a little, maybe a little deeper than that too, because really what it is, it's. I think it's like a sort of self admonition or admonishment. When they feel ignorant on something and they feel this need to outlash. You know, um, and you just don't see that in genuine scientific circles. You just don't engage in that. It's very rare because no one wants to look like an asshole. Like I would never go to I have peers that work in different fields than me, and I would never in my life try to tell this person what to think about
I've
things
looked
that
like an
we.
asshole several times in my job because I've had to uphold the standards of science, and I have unfortunately had several instances of being an asshole, but I hope people will see that those were necessary times and not that often.
Sure, sometimes you got to be an ass. Like I think in order to think, right, you have to risk being offensive. Um,
Well, it's just like if people are doing things and you have to go to court, you can't defend what you're doing, it's a problem.
yeah. Well, I mean, that's a whole basket of worms. I mean, just
Well, that was
courts
my
are just
job,
in
right? And the
general.
hilarious thing is we never even got into my job.
What is
It's
your
just
job?
like,
I'm
I
curious.
don't work anymore. I retired a long time ago, but when I worked, I was an
Well, good on you.
audio video analysis for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And I love that job. And I mean, you could argue it's applied physics. It's probably more like applied, signal processing, computer
Hmm.
science slash general model development. Like when you're on the cutting edge, you don't care about things like names.
That's an interesting job. Well, never met anybody who does anything like that.
It's a very, 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 very small field.
I
It's a
imagine.
multidisciplinary thing. So I don't have like training in consciousness, but I've studied it just my own consciousness.
Well, yeah, I
Um,
think I think having being intelligent. It's funny you say that because one thing I like to remind people of, especially when they're in my practice, is that everybody's a psychologist. We're all constantly practicing psychology day to day. Every interaction you have with another human, you're practicing psychology. You're just not really aware of it. And the difference between a person educated in psychology versus an individual who may not be often tends to be um, your ability to ascertain the observations. Like to really break those things down, right, and understand what you're actually observing versus the sort of subconscious way that we do it on a day-to-day basis. Just sort of more aware of what you're doing as opposed to not being able to do it, right? Um, so it's interesting you say that. Like no one needs to explain consciousness necessarily. Like you can gather that information on your own.
I do think consciousness needs to be explained.
well,
But
not explained in like the scientific sense, but I mean like in a colloquial way, right? Like when you're interacting with other people, you obviously recognize them as being having their own consciousness, right? And you can establish certain things about their conscious state of mind that's inferred and implied by their behavioral mechanisms and such when you're just interacting with them, right? You don't need anybody to explicitly tell you that often. Like an asshole's an asshole to you because they're an asshole and they're acting in assholeish ways. You know that.
I don't know that that's a universal judgment, though.
Oh, it wouldn't. No, but there's not a whole lot of things that genuinely are when it comes to that. Because it's all situational and subjective in a lot of ways. But but the difference would be like um, mediating and meeting out adjudications about mental aberrations and disorder and um, uh, sort of faulty thought processes and stuff like that. I mean, yeah, I mean that's obviously territories that most people don't fall under. But when it comes to the general scope and appeal, understanding of psychology, most people interact with that on a day-to-day basis without ever being aware of it.
So you're saying everybody has like a rudimentary theory of mind, therefore we're all psychologists?
No, but most of psychology is about human interaction, right? Like human behavior, behavioral theory, things of that nature. When you get into psychiatry, is when you really diverge from most people's general um, sort of knowledge base about what's going on, right? Um, really, the devil of psychology is in the details. Like that's really what it comes down to. Is like um, being able to correctly identify something more so than being able to just observe it, right? Like you don't generally come to a psychologist for somebody or like a therapist or something like that to observe the behavior necessarily, as much as you come to a therapist to learn ways to overcome the behavior because that person is expected to understand it on a deeper level.
That's interesting. Daryl says he put a band-aid on his cut finger. Does that mean we're all doctors? Oh, Daryl. This changes everything, Daryl. This is just the...
Potentially a medic. Depends on what your definition of doctor is. I don't know.
You're the first and only responder in that case.
Yes, there you go.
Where you want to take it from there, Daryl, that's totally up to you. No, it's all
So,
good.
out of curiosity, what's the most interesting thing that's happened to you in your job?
That's a really hard one. I don't know if I can put an exact like.
Well, maybe most interesting is a little too vague anyway. Um, just
I got a guy to be ultra triggered once due to my incredibly amazing skills in science, and it was pretty funny
what was his
because
reaction?
he lost his composure, and he was one of those like frumpy Brits.
He did the huff and puff.
He did a bit of Huff and Puff, yeah. No, but like, come on. I mean, I don't want to say that it's the most interesting. It's just sort of one that comes to mind. There were a lot of amazingly cool times, but probably most people would find it mostly boring, but punctuated with mildly interesting anecdotes.
I've never really understood that. Why people find. I mean, I guess I understand it on a certain level. Why they may. Um, but for me personally, I can't relate to the idea that somebody's story or you know, um, recounting of their experiences throughout the day or through their job or whatnot. Those aren't boring to me. Maybe I'm just really interested in people. Like I like people. I like to get to know somebody. Um, I think there's a lot to learn from other people, and I find that I learn the most when I'm interacting with other people as opposed to just reading a book, right? Which is also a form of interacting, I suppose. But I never really understood that. Why is it so boring to people to listen to their tales? Right?
What's boring?
Why certain people find it boring to listen to another person's day or another person's tales from their life or their experiences. Like I think a lot of people find that stuff kind of not very engaging, and for me, it's always been engaging, right? Like just so much to gather from that, right?
Yeah, I guess that's probably why you're in the field that you're in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I think uh, I think that you can learn a lot from other people vicariously, and I do my best thinking when I'm engaging with somebody. Uh, I think that's the best way to do that for me personally, at least.
Engaging in the sense of spending a long time of making sure that you're not talking past each other or asking strategic questions, or
Yeah.
what do
Well,
you mean by that?
having an actual conversation. Yeah. So like engaging with the individual without the attempt to control and completely control the conversation. I think a lot of people are often guilty of just waiting to speak in conversation, so they're not actively listening to anybody, which um, makes it hard for you to engage with the ideas that they're presenting if you're not actually listening to them, obviously,
You
right?
have to actually wait till you get traction with what someone cares about if you're actually going to teach them anything. So yeah, there's a definite validity to going into why
Yeah,
and what people believe.
yeah. I mean, you're never gonna climb the mountain you know, if you don't actually pay attention to where you're climbing. Right? Like you have to actually engage with the mountain to scale it. And I think I look at most people as being, most people are not threatening to me in that way. Like I don't find other people's intelligence to be threatening, but I find a lot of people do sort of engage with other people that they find intelligent if they find themselves lacking or wanting.
It's not
Um,
the other person's intelligence, it's the idea that other people will perceive them as unintelligent as they fear they are.
that's actually a good point. Yeah, that's a keen observation about it. Yeah, I can agree with that.
So maybe there's some value to just assimilating that fact. And I don't know if it translates to being patient with people when they're having like a freak out, but yeah, just to me, I guess you were there earlier when I ejected that person that was just being completely unreasonable. So I think that's
Yeah,
pretty
I can
much that's
understand.
called for.
Yeah, I can understand being frustrated. To that somebody doesn't seem to get what you're saying, or that you don't get what they're saying. But to immediately just begin yelling, I mean, obviously doing that is not going to lead to anything proactive about the conversation. Like where do you go from there? The moment you start yelling, you've robbed yourself of the ability to actually have a communication. Like what the fuck? Like what is the point of this? I was just sitting there like I think I was washing some dishes and I was listening like what the fuck is going on now? That's
It's like,
and that's
okay, that escalated really quickly.
like even if you disagree with somebody, like be mindful and respectful of the fact that they're a human being. You know, like for instance, I came late into this conversation that you were having, so that's why I was like, hey, I don't know if I'm sure you maybe established these things already, but I don't actually know, so I'm just asking if it's not too much of a bother, could you answer me? Because I have no idea what the hell's going on in this conversation anymore. It's just sort of like degraded, you know, like what is going on. So you know, and just asking politely for things. It's amazing how that works, right? Like I don't.
Well,
I don't
here's the problem is that we got to a topic that was really hard to understand, and I was trying to explain why it was hard to understand, which got interpreted as you don't think I can understand, and how dare you? And then you came in, and it's like, okay, I'm going to explain it to you, but then that's going to involve saying that there's this topic that has previously proven so hard to understand that it precipitated several instances of conflict. Though I will concede that the last person was clearly looking for conflict.
came in with
So
the guns already fucking hot, loaded up. He was ready to go.
I'm
I mean,
like, sorry, go ahead.
no, that can be fun. I mean, no doubt. Like, if I were just having like a troll conversation, which I don't often engage in, but if you were just having like a, I don't know, if you were just like with your friends or something, and just having a stupid ass conversation like this, and that's the way you engage with your particular type of people, sure. But when you're in like a of any sort of public forum whatsoever, like that's just obviously not going to get you what you're looking for. If you're actually looking for a genuine answer, and if you want somebody to admit that they're, if you genuinely think that they're wrong, and you want someone to admit that they're wrong, yelling at them never fucking works. That's just not going to get you anywhere. Like, what is the point of this? That's what frustrates me. What is the fucking purpose of what you're doing? Have you been stopped to think about what the purpose of what you're saying is? What's your goal? Does it align? You know? Ugh.
I just look at it as like the ability to have conversation like this is sort of sacred to me. And those kinds of conversations are of a different class. So I look at myself as a defender of the honor of tradition in those cases where it's conflicting. But with someone who is, whatever it is you are, not openly hostile, I suppose, to friendly, somewhere in between those two. I don't want to speak for you, but more of a open discussion and pleasant vibe of people exploring ideas at their leisure, I guess.
Yeah. I,
'Cause this is special to me because like there's no aggression, whereas basically everyone we've talked to, or I've talked to to this point on the stream, even though it didn't necessarily start out aggressive, it got aggressive at least at one point in the combo.
yeah. Yeah. There's just no need for antagonism, right? Um. And look, Daryl. I mean, obviously I'm not claiming to know exactly what's going on. All I can tell you is what I saw from my personal perspective. I mean, to be honest, it's not that serious to me to go look. I have better things to probably do with my time, to be quite honest. But um, I actually don't even know where your YouTube stream is, or your YouTube channel.
I'll
So
put a
check it out.
link in the let me see here. I'll probably get in trouble if I post it in the main stage chat, so I'll put it
Oh
in
yeah,
the self promo.
sure.
There we go.
But all I can say is this: like, when it comes to just interacting with people in general, um, in my personal experience as a psychologist, I've never seen anything good come from hostility. Even if somebody were acting like, let's say, and I don't I don't know you at all, Jen, but let's say Jen was being a complete asshat and being completely disingenuous the entire time. Let's just say that, right? That doesn't make any difference to the way that you interact with them. You don't have to engage with that on that level. And if you see a conversation slipping into that sort of thing, you can always just disengage. There's no need for you to push the conversation. And if somebody is having conversations that are that derogatory of nature, what are you really hoping to accomplish? Because at that point, if you continue engaging with somebody who's completely antagonistic and openly hostile towards you, um, then you're just looking for that engagement at
I've
that
done
point.
it
What do you,
sometimes
yeah,
in order to make people feel less afraid to have conversations. Some people avoid conversations because there's a non-zero probability of conflict.
right,
I wanted to set an example and say, like, it sucks, get insulted a whole bunch to go live and whatever else. It's not the end of the world. And then everyone's better for it if we put the intention towards learning.
sure, yeah, agreed.
Most
I don't,
people
I don't.
should not do this.
Yeah, there's no point in if there's a difference between a conversation and a debate. And that's why I asked Bill, like, is this supposed to be like a debate or what is this supposed to be right now? Because I'm like, listen, this is not it's not a debate right now at all.
How long have you been on this server?
This particular server, it's been a while. I don't often engage. I usually have a lot of things to do, but today I'm off early, so I don't really have anything to do at the moment. So I was
So
sort of
you haven't seen much of the content.
no, not really.
Um, It does tend to get contentious. This is probably the most hostile
Yeah.
server that I'm part of and
I think I've seen a.
contribute to in this manner.
I think I joined this server when they still had open stages that you could like the live stages. You can join on Discord. And I remember listening to it, and a lot of times people sort of devolves into, like you said, this sort of pretentious, precocious sort of, weird argumentation that's just going on, where people are just sort of, it's not even so much ad hominem, it's just sort of like disingenuous misrepresentation of other people. Uh, it's not even like straw manning, there's a bunch of stuff that goes down that I had
There's
noticed.
grandstanding.
Oh,
I find the grandstanding extremely tedious because it's like I'd really love to engage with someone's idea, and if I can't pause you in the middle of it, I don't need to pause you in the explanation of what you're saying right now because this is personal anecdotes. I love hearing them in their totality, but some concepts are very difficult. These abstract things, right? I may have to stop someone. If it's considered gauche to do that, that's going to really torpedo things because I'm going to have a list of questions longer than the initial lecture, which was pretty long. It doesn't make for good, to me. This is good content. That
oh, yeah.
and it's hard to follow.
Yeah, yeah, I understand what you mean. If somebody is actively just sort of just rambling on, and especially if what they're talking about is just sort of nonsense, um, by all means, like at some point in time, you kind of have to just cut in there. But if you're that's why there's a difference between a classical debate where people have like periods of time to speak, present their arguments, then you have your retorts and such, and your opening statements and all that stuff. Like, that's an entirely different format than having an open conversation, an open-ended conversation on a public discourse channel, right? It's not the same sort of format, so therefore, obviously, you're gonna expect some interjection, and you should, right? Like if you are educated in the field and someone's saying something that's complete bullshit, I think obviously most people are probably gonna interject at some point. I don't think that's necessarily wrong.
Sure, if stuff goes against common consensus where there is such a thing, it's going to need to be addressed. I'm not sure if that's what you're alluding to, or you're just alluding to complex concepts, or what exactly. But
The latter. I mean, the former. Excuse me. Yeah, I think there's definitely room for people to sort of like interject a correction. Um, there's no point to listening to somebody's entire stream of consciousness. I suppose, like I say, if you already know that the grounding basis for what they're trying to ascribe you to understand is flawed from the jump. It's sort of like if they're trying to talk about a triangle, but they've already described a square, sort of like why would I listen to? Right? I don't want to waste everybody's time listening to this concept that you're trying to unpack when it doesn't. It's just faulty from the jump. Right?
hey, Frank's here. Going on?
Jen,
Oh,
how do you define time?
oh, you're doing it, aren't you? You're taking the ring of power. You're sliding it down that finger, aren't you?
I just wanted to make. I was listening. I went to the gym and I was listening to your conversation with Quantum and whoever else was there. I don't remember what their name was, but I heard you saying something like, um, uh, change happens before there can be change before time or something like that. So I was just wondering how you define time in that sense.
Are you familiar with 3+1?
I am.
Time time is a shadow that 3 plus it's a shadow of 3+1. That's what time is. +1 out of 3+1. Time is a shadow of that.
I always consider time to be, isn't time like something like motion or something like that in yours? In I mean, I've always considered that's what time is, like just motion. and everything that came before the universe was static. So,
Interesting. I think that is a fair way to say that, to describe a certain branch of physics. It may just be called motion. I actually looked it up the other day. I think it's just called motion, and as things like the acceleration due to gravity that has a particular equational representation that has as one of its variables time and velocity, acceleration, and so forth.
okay. That's all I was wondering. And causality. So, because the causality happens before time as well, right?
Well, time and causality are all bound, those things are all bound up together. What I'm trying to get people to do is to consider concepts individually and to sort of try them on to see how easy they are to conceive of without necessarily committing to them ontologically or epistemologically or any way. And hopefully get my point across for due consideration, nothing more, and basically not have it degenerate to like causality. Generally, though, it means you can talk about what are the requisites for causality. Like you can go into this to any detail you want, but it's the general idea that you have some causes and then effects happen. And the causes, the effects are dependent on the causes.
What do you think
Generally, how it's
about
understood.
coexisting cause and effect, like Quantum was asking?
We would have to go into we'd have to dig really deep. It's going to sound like a semantic digression, but it's not. We just actually have to make sure that we are parameterizing the system along natural boundaries. Nature has some energetic differentials. If we define words such that we're destroying them, then that's at cross purposes with defining words. And when I say words, I mean like things we're going to observe in physics.
Okay, that's all I wanted to ask.
You asked
I hope
before
you have.
about what is time. I don't think I fully answered what
Yes,
time
yes.
is. I didn't fully
Go.
answer
Yeah.
what time is. But in short, time is one of the most useful concepts. And it has a multi-dimensional presence. It is exceedingly difficult to conceptualize. And I don't know where to go from there, but based on people's responses and where they go, I will just keep adapting what I'm saying to help further an understanding of that, and hopefully end result of that will be a better, deeper understanding of physics, which I think can only really happen when everyone moves forward sort of together. So forgive me for rambling. Hey, Order of Melchizedek, did you?
Yeah, Jen, I just wanted you. So I was interested in like your response that. So we're just kind of touching base off of like what is time again. When you gave the example, of 3+1, right, Frank? And then he said, yeah. He said it's a shadow of 3+1. Could you just give a little bit more clarification or try to simplify that? Just because like I found your response interesting. So
I could give you a diagram that potentially explain it. But
okay,
it's
yeah.
not
Could
it's not
you?
going to give
That's
you,
what's up.
here's the thing, it's not going to give you a complete understanding, and if you think it's going to give you a complete understanding, that's actually going to make it harder to get even a partial understanding, which is the only thing you should expect is realistic right now at best. And it's fine
Yeah.
if you don't understand right away, and you should be happy to even understand a little bit, because some people spend lifetimes and never understand. I don't want to have to start rambling about the whole lucid dreaming thing. Guy who studied his whole career never achieved a single lucid dream thing, but you may
You
be
can still
farther ahead than you think.
do.
You may be less far ahead than you think. Here's the thing, when you're just starting out with answering and framing these questions, you don't really know where you are, do you? None of us does. Okay.
Right.
We shouldn't suppose one way or the other. That's basically what I'm getting at.
Right.
Well, mea culpa, really nice to talk to you, and I hope you had fun, and I hope it was beneficial to you a little bit, and that we can connect again at some point. All right, so I'm going to try to find the best diagram for this.
You can send it to me personally, or you can put it in the chat.
Oh, you know I'm gonna put out some fresh bait. You know that. I mean, come on, the stream's only been going for 3 hours. Sorry for chuckling like a madman here. I'm easily amused. Dang it. I'm easily amused. All right, so you want to have a look at my diagram?
Hey Jen, you streaming this on your YouTube channel?
Yeah.
I was wondering because I'm like, I went to the gym, came back, and she's still on. I was like, I wonder, wonder what she's doing.
I love that you stream the combos to that channel. Tom should promote that channel more. It only has like less than, I don't even know how many subs. It doesn't seem like that many.
Oh, we're gonna get more because I mean, I'm gonna be streaming the convo I'm gonna have with Tom tomorrow. So, hopefully, I can get a couple more viewers from that. So,
Okay, let me see here.
Nice talking to you, Frank. And yeah, for those interested, tomorrow, have a look at the events there. E-Jump will be asked questions. Atheists get asked all the time, and if you're interested, join in. If there's any questions you'd like to add to the list, send them on over. That is in 24 hours. So enjoy that. Go ahead. Melchizedek, sorry about that. Where were we?
No, you're okay. You're fine.
Oh, right, we were talking about time, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm
what's
looking at the
time? I mean,
diagram here.
here's the thing, like, you and I can agree that time is the thing on a watch, right?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
But that's not all that
It isn't.
time
It
is.
isn't.
That's
Right.
not
Right.
all that time is. Time is more than that. Time is, we would like for our universal definition of time to be consistent with our perception of time in my school of reasoning, for reasons of memorization, which makes it a bit difficult because it's unwieldy to integrate in a mechanical way. And sort of coming back to what we were talking about before, we can't really establish temporal causality. And to attempt to establish temporal causality is to introduce a sort of artifacting in your analysis. When you're framing things wrong and you have to keep referring to the original frame over and over in the analysis, you're piling on the same error. And to have that error happen across all experimentation does not cancel it out. It amplifies it. It doesn't really give you a way to think past it unless you're accounting for the fact that this is something that we can easily fall into.
Mm-hmm.
Do
So
you see my diagram?
I did see it. Yes.
Okay, so where's time in this? Time is an extension.
Is it okay? So that's right after the localization. Okay.
So the thing we experience as time, what physics has told us we can experience as time is delta t. Okay, delta t.
Mm-hmm.
We can't establish t. We can have a perception of time as a single thing.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever we go to do something in physics, time isn't defined without an interval. And this is crucially important. So if I say time is a moment, then I'm conceptualizing it as a localization. If I'm perceiving time as an interval, I'm conceiving it as a line.
Mm-hmm.
Do you follow that train of reasoning?
Yes. So far.
That's really all that there is, and that's one way to define time because the figure at the bottom is 3
Mm-hmm.
plus 1.
Yeah, I
So
see that.
a figure at the very bottom represents 3 plus 1, and time is Shadow of a shadow of 3 plus 1. You just take 2 maps to go to the time extension from the original 3 plus 1 identity, which is the actual atemporal thing. The geometries are considered atemporal because it's just as true to say something is caused by a sphere in the past as it's caused by a sphere in the future, if we can agree to the notion that things would be caused by spheres. And I'm not saying that they are, I'm just, if the causal agent is outside of the domain of observability, it would appear to be a temporal if observability and temporality are indistinguishable. I know that this is probably a bit too complex. Did any of that make sense? You're muted. I don't know if you want to respond or if you want me to try to explain this even more, get another diagram out.
Yeah, Joan, maybe another one. Or real quick, the way that I understood at least time, like in reference to psychology, right? It's time is like I believe it's described as the product of mind more than a reflection of natural chronometric order.
I don't know that we could establish that we're using anything other than a I don't want to say metaphysically primitive notion of time, but our definition of time is pretty much derivative of the speed of light.
Mm-hmm. What if we were to refer it to like temporal? So like you were saying, you said that time is one of the most useful concepts. It has a multi-dimensional presence. So in psychology, it can refer to temporal dimensions such as duration, pace, and the order of perceived and internal events. Would you agree with that?
Well, that's a completely different, it's a different question. You're into a theory of mind now, so we're not.
Oh,
We
okay,
want to
yeah.
avoid
Let's
a
say,
theory
I'm
of
sorry,
mind.
yeah.
If
Right,
we want to
okay.
establish time, like I'm not saying we're never going to have a theory of mind. I'm just saying that the theory of mind will make a lot more sense if we can get a physics theory making sense first.
Mm-hmm.
And how people have described time doesn't really do anything but establish that there isn't a consensus and definition of the term. But at the very least, we can say, well, look, there's this watch, it's moving. I mean, that's time. And we have a cesium atom telling us what the mini temporal interval is. We can know what time is because we know what the speed of light is. We can measure it over known sizes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm vastly oversimplifying here. At that time, I mean, that's clearly something that transcends our observation devices at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, in what way does it transcend our observation devices? And when you start talking about the human consciousness, how time works with light when time itself arises from light becomes unclear. And so you need to really have a long consideration of what the right model is, or it becomes incoherent almost immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Daryl says time is the interval between events and space is the interval between objects. Okay, then you have to define objects and events, Daryl. You're still in this self-referential trap here, Daryl. I don't know, have you noticed some people get in this, they can't get out of the self-reference trap? Notice this?
Right, I see what you're saying.
Like when they're talking about consciousness, and then I'm like, okay, we'll define consciousness, and they're like, awareness. And I'm like, define awareness, and they're like, fuck you.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Sorry, that was my attempt at a joke. Is any of this making sense? Because I can take it to the next step of explanation. I'm not sure where you're at in terms of your understanding or what you want to talk about.
I mean, everything your model was a good help, and then you explaining it. So I'm on board so far, but I'm not sure if everybody else is.
Well, they don't have to be on board. They can come on board anytime they want. It's not up to us to push people on board. It's up to us to have a good vibe so that people will do the best that they can with the information that they have available. And Simon asked, why would an understanding of physics be required to test a theory of mind? Might help. Might help a lot. Physics can be validated with a lot of certainty because it's quantitative. Quantitative cuts out a lot, which is a weakness, but it's also a strength. So you got to use the things for their strengths wisely.
To basically to narrow the field, right? Narrow down.
That's another one of these very important concepts, is that anything that involves a value judgment involves narrowing the field, because the making of the judgment and the narrowing of the field are physically indistinguishable processes.
Right. Well, Jen, if you want to proceed, I'm okay with it.
Proceed what?
Well, like dive in a little bit deeper, because you said you're like, I don't know if you want to continue or if you're like, if you want to get into something different, but like, do you happen to have like
The way it works in the tradition is that we don't proselytize. So if someone wants to know something, they come and ask questions, and then the questions get answered. But sometimes there is some time that is spent reframing the questions, which can be frustrating. But if you understand that that's what's happening, I think it's cool. And maybe I haven't been the best at explaining that that's what's happening, because like for most people I've talked to this point, not saying you're bad faith, I think you're good faith. There's been a lot of like people who just want to kind of have a bit of a play fight. And that's like a boys will be boys thing, whatever, like, don't whatever, it's fine. But it's not really my vibe. It's stressful. I will handle it if I have to. But all that to say that like I don't have a script ready to try to bring you on board my system, because when we consider people to join our religion, we're seeing it as a liability. It's like everything's working fine. We don't need anybody. Now we're going to bring someone else on board. That's a pure risk. So but at the same time, I don't mind I don't mind explaining secular things. So then it would come down to, what are you interested in learning on a secular level? And you said time. And I said, it's metaphysically, it's a shadow of what you could call a concrete object, if you want to look at it that way. But other than that, it would be, to answer the question any more specifically, would involve us going into a specific domain, because even time doesn't have this domain independent existence that lends it to a generalizable definition that way.
Yeah, I like what you said right there, and you kind of touched back on that. So it's a shadow of what you would call a concrete. And what was the last word that you used there?
I might have said existence, but I'm honestly not sure.
Okay.
I'm trying to be like delicate with the terms, and I know people are very, touchy about the use of certain language. I enjoy jargon myself, and I'm just not sure exactly how to phrase it. Just gonna scroll back
I don't know if was it what you would call a concrete object or a concrete concept?
I was only saying concrete due to Neoplatonism, just so you know, because I know you're Christian.
Right, but
So
I'm not looking at it from that perspective right now. I'm trying to understand your position here, your explanation.
You want to understand my position, meaning what? You want to understand, because the thing is that I'm not talking about my personal philosophy ever.
No, I didn't take it that way. I mean, I had just joined. I only got the last part of the half here. You said you've been streaming for 3 hours, so.
Well, it started on a conversation of whether it was basically just an open conversation about atemporal causality with quantum, which obviously didn't go very far. And then there were like some trolls, and then there was a guy who was super nice. He may still be in the audience. Yeah, mea culpa. And he just came on and basically we talked a bit
Mhm.
about topics that were you're having a bit of hot miking, clicking on your line. You're
Yeah,
gonna
I'm
make noise
sorry.
if you don't mind muting.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. We just talked just a little bit of nice back and forth. It was great to have I don't know what the right word is. Intimate is the wrong word, but like frank and open convo with somebody that wasn't, feeling like it was a setup for a got you moment. And Mea Culpa says, though personally I will say having a greater understanding in any field, regardless of relation to the field, makes everything easier to nail down. Yeah, one would hope that if one were studying a topic, it would give a perspective that would give greater clarity, ideally interdisciplinary clarity if such a thing is possible. And Daryl says everything we observe in nature is an observation regarding the position in time and the position in space. Daryl. This is not good. Okay? They're literally defining
Jen.
things. They're defining things self-referentially in the definition. Now, what would that be? A level 0 regress? I need a name for this. This is worse than consciousness is awareness. Awareness is consciousness. Infinity circle. This is like consciousness is consciousness bad. Poor Daryl. And I don't know if you can get any insight as to this, but yeah, it all kind of comes down to how well we interpret our our measurements with like machines and stuff. And we're also performing some type of measurement ourselves. Then it's like a question of, is it a measurement or processing or what's direction is it going in? Like when you're seeing light, something is going into your eye. And that would be,
Yeah.
something that has an effect inside of you and outside of you. There is no distinction. The effect itself is non-local. And that's very hard to conceive of. We are localized to our bodies. And so we're really, I don't want to say maybe it's impossible to conceive of non-locality, but it's quite challenging. So that doesn't mean we have to now try to conceive of non-locality. It just means we need to accept that non-locality is hard to conceive of and go from there. But usually the combo gets stuck on a level of like, well, I don't actually think it's non-locality. Something to that effect. So yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to put it forward in a manner that I think will be intuitive in several diagrams and such.
Mm-hmm.
But do you have a domain we could talk about time in? Any domain.
Well, I think it would be best to like tune into your stream, and then if I have any other questions with you, I know you're pretty open about certain things. I know you invited me into another thing to explain one of your models, so I know you're pretty open. But yeah, I'd like to just watch from the beginning. I know you said that there were some people who were not really taking it seriously at first, but I would just like to hear more and then try to see if I can get more information from that, and then ask you after.
We did not go into this at all.
Oh,
It
okay.
was there was hardly, in my opinion, hardly any explanation of anything that would constitute a theory of time. But if you're not sure what to ask now about time, that's totally fine, and we can go into it more. But I would say if you want to talk about it, the more specific of a domain that you're personally interested in, that I can relate it to something you already recognize, the better. That's how the memory process works. It's also a memory technique as well as like actual teachings about how things work.
Uh, what is something that like a domain pertaining to like time that um like someone with my belief would cater to? What's a pretty interesting
Well, what's your belief?
um like specifically when it comes to this concept of time, or
Well, you said, what is something that someone of my belief would enjoy to know about time? And I need to know what your belief is before I can tell you that.
so well, as a Christian, well, I want to see just what do you think about, like, for instance, like the Kalam argument.
It's self-refuting. Okay, so here's the thing. You got to decompose what it's actually saying. So okay, why
Mhm.
don't you do you think you could summarize it for me as quickly as possible?
Yeah, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe had or the universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause.
Right. So where does a supposition one come from?
um, well, isn't that the presumption based off of
It is
like
a it is a 100% unqualified presumption that is itself based upon reasoning that
mhm,
presupposes a unmoved mover.
right? And
Ironic,
so that's
right? So the unmoved mover is understood as the universe, right?
mhm,
And then you're saying, well, the universe began to exist. That's wrong. Uh, and anything that begins to exist has a cause. Well, that's only true if you have a first cause that is uncaused, right?
mhm.
So the whole argument is, I think, self-refuting. For the suppositions contradict each other.
Even if they posit that the unmoved mover is like God.
Then you can just cut out God and replace it with the universe and make a metaphysical simplicity argument.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That's why the
Let me
arguments are
substitute it.
powerful. They're powerful arguments because they're true when you're applying them to the universe. So there's a level on which our emotions are in tune with those Aquinas arguments. That's why they're so pernicious. We have to make sure that we're hearing what they're actually saying rather than falling in love with an apparition of what may not be.
Right. Okay.
Did you say you're not a Christian anymore? You feel like I don't know, or you feel so very spiritual?
Well, I am a Christian, but again, when I'm trying to earnestly get people's responses, I try to remove myself as much as I possibly can. Uh, so that way I try not, so that way I can eliminate any preconceived thoughts or notions or anything like that. I just want to hear you out, especially you, Jen. So,
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. I generally don't actually care whether someone identifies as a Christian or an atheist, because to me it doesn't make any difference. It's just about arguments, really. As cheesy as that sounds, like it's mostly geometric style arguments. So if someone is identified as a Christian, what the hell do I care? It literally changes nothing unless it changes something for them. Same with atheists, though I will say that like most people I've had success in sharing ideas with have been very skeptical people.
yeah, again, yeah, I'm trying to remove the preconceived thoughts or notions and my skepticism. Um, because I feel like the points that you do make, especially after looking into them myself, I'll be honest, Jen, like when I'm trying to understand some of the models that you've put forth or that you've gone over before in the past, they're very interesting. And when I start to learn more about it, at first I'm like, I'll be honest, Jen, I don't have a clue as to what you're understanding. But that determination, because I don't have a clue, makes me want to know what it is that you're talking about. And so, like when I dive and dig a little bit deeper, which takes a while, I'll be honest, takes a while to understand what it is that is. I almost have to peel back like layers of an onion But once I get to a point of understanding and like, oh, I see what she was saying, then it becomes clear.
Does it give you a warm and fuzzy feeling at times?
Doesn't make, well, it gets me giddy, you know, gets me like a little child, like I'm like, oh, I understood what she was
Okay.
teaching me.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, it's like for me, this is the sort of stuff that I look forward to the extent that I can, because it's so difficult that there's a chance that there'll be a very long period of time, quote unquote, wink, wink, where no one will understand basically anything that I'm saying, and it'll just be fights. But the
Mhm.
times where people get that insight and you can actually see their lives be improved by it, well, it makes all the horrible stuff 100% worthwhile. Again, not saying that anyone should feel compelled to follow in my footsteps. You know, that's not the lesson to take from this.
Mhm. Yeah, this is kind of off topic as well, Jen, but
Oh, no such thing. Go
uh,
ahead.
okay. Um, Speaking about like trying to remove preconceived thoughts and notions and like expectations. I just saw a recent T jump stream with him talking about somebody else, and I said, I wanted to talk to T jump, not to debate, but just to get to know the guy. Just because like some of the debates I have seen, um, I kind of look at atheists as like, as a Christian, but again, I try to remove myself from that. I kind of see them as like, oh, like they're the intellectual like enemies, right, to our Christian philosophers or uh, Christian apologetics. But after I watched his stream yesterday, I was like, he seems like a really good guy, you know. Um, so I'm just pointing out like me being consistent with taking the factor of like not having preconceived thoughts or notions about certain people or things. I try to remove myself from that. And no, that was really nice, at least for me to see that side of him and like, like, hey, this guy's a pretty good dude.
Yeah, what was he talking about?
Well, they were talking about well, they were having mic issues at first. But I think right before the mic issues, um, he had like this smile. Uh, um, and they were talking about like catching up, how you been, how are you doing, and talking about someone who's like 8 or 9, like a child, and you could just see him smile, like he had a very heart-warmed smile, and so that's why I was just like, this he's just like anybody else.
Yeah, maybe a lot of people got traumatized by religion or things connected to problems with religion, and maybe got stuck in an unhealthy way of operating.
Hmm.
People getting past it though with stories of hope to be really inspiring. So I'm glad to see that you've perceived his improved joy, I guess.
Hmm.
He does seem to
But
be getting sharper in the debates for sure. Like, do you remember the
I'll
first
agree on
time I
that.
debated him? Do you remember the first time I debated him?
I do. Uh, he was just like anybody else at first, where they were like, they're like you could tell that they're the pauses and stuff, and like the hesitation is like, how do I approach this?
He just thought I was going to be another Darth Dawkins, I think. I mean, I probably didn't, I could have gone a lot further to be more serious, but I feel like that would have made my job a lot harder, and it would have made things bogged down for a lot longer. And now we can just have a way better combo than, I don't know, how long can somebody really keep their attention on a given topic for? I want to say 2.5 minutes, but who knows? All right, so I guess we'll wrap it up for now, and unless you wanted to take it in a different direction,
No, that sounds good, Jen. If I'll kind of just think about our dialogue here, and if anything comes up, I'll reach out to you.
I'll think about where we can go from here as well, and appreciate all the feedback from the audience. We'll see you all Sunday, week in review. Looking forward to that as usual. Good